I never told my arrogant daughter-in-law I held the deed to the very house she was trying to kick me out of. She called me a worthless burden. My own son nodded along, sipping his expensive bourbon. I stayed completely quiet. Then on a freezing Christmas Eve, they handed me a cheap suitcase and told me the best gift I could give them was to disappear forever. I am Cyrus, 70 years old, a retired logistics entrepreneur who spent a lifetime building a quiet fortune. As an African-American man who fought for every inch of success, I learned early on that silence is a weapon. That night, I walked out into the snow, leaving them to their delusions. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. Heavy snow battered the frosted living room window with a relentless, freezing rhythm. The storm outside raged, but the atmosphere inside the lavish suburban living room felt infinitely colder. The warm glow of the artificial fireplace cast dancing shadows across the imported hardwood floor, creating a deceptive illusion of holiday cheer. The soft, joyful melodies of Christmas music played from the ceiling speakers. That fragile peace shattered instantly when Natalie dropped a hard plastic suitcase directly onto the floor. The cheap, hollow clatter of the plastic wheels scraping against the expensive wood cut through the music like a gunshot. The sound echoed in the massive room, demanding absolute attention. I stood near the mantel, watching the scene unfold with quiet calculation. Natalie crossed her arms, her posture radiating pure arrogance and disdain. I shifted my gaze toward the kitchen doorway. Devin, my own flesh and blood, stood leaning against the doorframe. He clutched a heavy crystal glass of expensive bourbon, his knuckles white from the tight grip. He absolutely refused to make eye contact with me. He kept his eyes locked on the amber liquid swirling in his glass, hiding his face behind a mask of cowardice. The contrast was staggering. Here was my son wearing a tailored cashmere sweater I had subtly paid for standing inside a $2 million house, refusing to look his father in the eye. The bright holiday decorations surrounding us only magnified the absolute cruelty of the cold moment. There was no warmth left in this house. The extravagant Christmas tree in the corner sparkled with hundreds of lights, but the shadows stretching across the floor told the real story. The stage was perfectly set for the ultimate devastating family betrayal. I remained completely silent, bracing myself for the ugly words I knew were coming. Soon. Natalie stepped forward, her expensive perfume masking the scent of the pine tree. She bluntly stated that my presence was actively ruining their marriage. She did not bother to soften the blow or offer a false apology. She shoved a crinkled printed paper directly into my hands. I looked down at the harsh black ink. It was a hastily compiled list of state-run low-income senior shelters located on the dangerous side of the city. She claimed the basement I currently occupied was urgently needed for her private yoga studio. She declared that her spiritual wellness required a dedicated, peaceful space, and my belongings were cluttering her vision. She demanded I leave the premises immediately tonight, regardless of the freezing blizzard roaring outside our walls. Her voice dripped with deep, undisguised entitlement. She pointed an accusatory finger at my chest, calling me a massive financial and emotional anchor, dragging their sophisticated lives straight into the ground. She ranted about the high costs of groceries, the rising utility bills, and the sheer inconvenience of having an old man disrupting her pristine aesthetic. I listened to her venomous speech without interrupting. I noted the sheer audacity of a woman standing in a home she did not actually own, trying to evict the very man who secretly held the master deed. She complained that my mere existence was a constant source of toxic stress, preventing Devin from focusing on his corporate career. Every word she spoke confirmed my deepest suspicions about her character. She felt absolutely entitled to a life built entirely on my hidden labor. She slapped her hand against the plastic suitcase, ordering me to pack my miserable clothes. She declared that the finest Christmas gift I could possibly give them both was my permanent absence, effective right this very single second. I slowly turned my head away from the infuriating woman shouting at me. I looked directly at Devin. He felt the heavy weight of my stare, yet he still refused to face me. Devin took a slow, deliberate sip of his expensive bourbon, letting the amber liquor burn his throat instead of speaking up. He nodded his head in silent agreement with his white wife. The cowardice radiating from him filled the massive living room. Devin finally mumbled a short, pathetic justification about needing adequate space to grow their new marriage. He claimed his mental health was suffering because my presence created an unbearable, restrictive environment. He completely ignored the grueling decades I spent sacrificing my youth to ensure he attended the finest university available. He disregarded the relentless labor that paid for his very existence. I stood completely still, internalizing the crushing reality of his choice. I felt the ultimate devastating betrayal slice deep into my core. My own flesh and blood had eagerly traded his profound loyalty for superficial comfort. He had chosen the malicious arrogance of a materialistic spouse over the father who had quietly paved his entire road to success. He placed his crystal glass softly onto the granite counter, silently endorsing my sudden homelessness on a freezing holiday night. There was absolutely no lingering affection left in his posture. He was waiting impatiently for me to grab my sparse belongings and vanish into the raging blizzard outside. I studied his face one final time, searching for a brief glimpse of the honorable boy I had proudly raised. I found nothing but an empty, status-obsessed stranger, entirely consumed by his own selfish greed. His absolute silence cemented his fate. The fragile bond of our shared family history snapped, permanently dissolving completely into the cold winter air. I did not shout at my ungrateful son. I did not drop to my knees and plead for holiday mercy. I simply accepted the cruel reality presented directly to me. I slowly zipped up my heavy wool winter coat, savoring the profound quiet that had suddenly replaced my lingering familial hope. I reached down and firmly gripped the handle of the cheap plastic suitcase Natalie had so disrespectfully thrown at my feet. I walked straight past them without uttering a single defensive syllable. I opened the heavy oak front door and stepped out into the freezing, violent blizzard. The freezing wind slapped my face instantly, but the biting temperature felt significantly warmer than the toxic environment I was leaving behind. As I walked down the snow-covered driveway, I mentally calculated the true cost of their staggering ignorance. I was walking away from the luxurious $2 million estate I had secretly purchased for them entirely in cash just 3 years ago. I had hidden my ownership status behind a strict blind trust to ensure Devin learned basic financial responsibility. I had endured living in the damp basement, playing the role of a destitute pensioner simply to test their fundamental character. They had failed the test spectacularly. They had brutally evicted their landlord from his own massive property on Christmas Eve. The heavy snow quickly covered my tire tracks as I pulled my truck out onto the deserted street. The quiet isolation of the dark road provided immense clarity. My phone buzzed loudly on the dashboard. 10 minutes had barely passed since my departure. Natalie sent a vicious text message demanding I immediately mail back the garage door opener so she could park her luxury vehicle inside. The ultimate game of ruthless consequences had officially begun without further warning or hesitation tonight. Now. The freezing wind howled violently against the shattered windshield wiper of my rusted 1998 pickup truck. Heavy snow battered the metal roof as I navigated the treacherous suburban roads away from the $2 million estate I secretly owned. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper Natalie had shoved into my chest. The list of state-run low-income senior shelters felt like a physical manifestation of her profound arrogance. I did not shed a tear. I rolled down the window and let the bitter winter draft snatch the paper from my fingers, watching the list disappear forever into the blinding white blizzard. I shifted the heavy manual transmission and steered the truck directly toward the glowing skyline of the city center. The roads grew slick with black ice, but my hands remained perfectly steady on the worn leather steering wheel. I bypassed the crowded downtown avenues and turned into a private, discreet alleyway hidden completely behind the financial district. A massive steel door rose automatically as my license plate registered in the advanced security system. I drove down the sweeping concrete ramp into the brilliantly lit, heated underground parking garage of the most exclusive residential high-rise in the entire metropolitan area. High-end sports cars and sleek imported sedans lined the pristine parking bays. I pulled my battered truck into the oversized private space reserved specifically for the building owner. The engine sputtered and died with a heavy metallic clunk. The absolute quiet of the secure garage offered immediate sanctuary from the chaotic storm raging above. I stepped out of the truck and grabbed my cheap plastic suitcase. The wheels clattered loudly against the smooth epoxy floor as I walked toward the private gold-plated elevator doors waiting exclusively for my arrival. The gold-plated elevator doors slid open to reveal the grand marble lobby of the luxury high-rise. The night concierge immediately stood at attention behind his polished mahogany desk. He straightened his tailored suit and greeted me by name with absolute, unwavering respect, welcoming me back to my property. I offered a brief nod and stepped into the direct access express elevator. The digital floor indicator climbed rapidly toward the top of the tower. I stepped out into the sprawling multi-level private penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a commanding panoramic view of the entire snow-covered city. I purchased this exact building entirely in cash a decade ago after successfully selling my heavy machinery logistics firm to a corporate conglomerate. My late wife Naomi and I had started that company with nothing but a single flatbed truck and relentless determination. When Naomi passed away, the massive fortune felt incredibly hollow. I chose to hide the vast extent of my wealth from Devon completely. I desperately wanted to teach my son the irreplaceable value of honest, grueling labor. I needed him to understand the grit required to build a legacy from the ground up. I fabricated a story about a modest pension and quietly moved into the basement of the suburban house I bought for his wedding. I endured Natalie's endless condescension to evaluate the true character of the man my son had become. Standing alone in my silent penthouse, the bitter reality solidified in my mind. The grueling financial test was over, and Devon had failed with catastrophic arrogance. I left the cheap plastic suitcase near the entryway. I walked across the imported rugs toward my executive desk, fully preparing to systematically dismantle the comfortable illusion my son currently enjoyed. I walked over to the crystal decanter resting on the sidebar and poured myself a tall glass of cold water. The freezing liquid sharpened my senses as I sat down in the high-backed leather chair behind my mahogany desk. I opened my secure encrypted laptop and instantly accessed my private financial dashboard. I bypassed the massive corporate trust ledgers and logged directly into the shared emergency bank account I maintained specifically for Devon. I had established this particular fund years ago strictly to prevent my son from facing absolute financial ruin during medical emergencies or sudden job losses. The screen illuminated with fresh transaction data. My eyes locked onto a massive, newly authorized pending charge. Natalie had just swiped the emergency card for an exorbitant amount at an elite luxury winter ski resort in Aspen. She was actively booking first-class flights, premium chalet accommodations, and private snowboarding lessons. The staggering arrogance of the transaction practically radiated from the screen. My daughter-in-law had ruthlessly evicted me into a freezing blizzard while simultaneously using my emergency safety net to fund her lavish holiday vacation. She labeled me a severe financial burden while actively draining my resources to pay for her extravagant lifestyle. Devon had allowed her to weaponize my quiet generosity. The sheer audacity erased any lingering shred of paternal hesitation in my mind. I reviewed the itemized receipt tracing the thousands of dollars allocated for vintage champagne and spa treatments. They believed they had successfully disposed of a useless old man entirely unaware that the man they discarded held the absolute power to ruin their financial existence with a single keystroke. I cracked my knuckles and prepared to execute the first phase of their immediate downfall. I placed my hands firmly over the keyboard and navigated to the primary security settings of the emergency bank account. I did not issue a warning or a final plea for basic human decency. I executed a hard, irrevocable freeze on the entire credit line. I permanently revoked Devon's administrative access, instantly severing the financial umbilical cord he had secretly relied on for years. The banking portal processed the command with a satisfying digital chime. The sudden block triggered an automatic cascading cancellation of Natalie's non-refundable holiday booking. The luxury ski resort system immediately rejected the frozen card, terminating their first-class flights and premium chalet reservations in a matter of seconds. The illusion of their boundless wealth evaporated before the transaction could even clear the central bank. I sat back in the leather chair watching the dashboard confirm the complete lockdown of the funds. They were now completely exposed to the harsh reality of their actual income. I took a slow sip of my water, relishing the profound silence of my penthouse. Suddenly, the screen blinked aggressively. A bright red security alert popped up in the center of the monitor, demanding my immediate attention. The notification displayed a highly secure, restricted joint investment fund I had established when Devon was a teenager. Devon was actively bypassing the standard banking protocols. The system showed my son frantically attempting to withdraw $50,000 in a desperate, unauthorized wire transfer. The timing of the massive withdrawal attempt indicated sheer panic. Devon was aggressively trying to secure a massive amount of liquid cash behind my back. The quiet adjustment of my legacy had instantly escalated from a simple credit freeze into an active financial war against my own son. The morning sun offered absolutely no warmth as it reflected off the fresh layers of snow covering the city streets. I drove my rusted 1998 pickup truck toward the industrial sector on the outskirts of town. I needed to check on the climate-controlled storage unit where I kept the most precious remnants of my life with Naomi. After she passed away, I had carefully wrapped and preserved her favorite antique furniture, intending to save these irreplaceable heirlooms for future generations. I pulled up to the heavy iron security gates of the facility and rolled down my window. The facility manager stepped out of his heated booth and approached my vehicle with a deeply concerned expression. He recognized me immediately as one of his premium corporate clients. He leaned against the icy door frame and delivered news that instantly tightened the muscles in my chest. He informed me that my son Devin had arrived at the facility just before dawn. Devin had not come alone. He had brought a private locksmith and boldly claimed he had lost the primary keys to the family unit. Because I had listed Devin as an emergency secondary contact on the original rental agreement years ago, the manager permitted the entry. The locksmith had completely drilled through the heavy-duty titanium padlock. My son had forcefully breached the secure sanctuary, holding his own mother's physical legacy without uttering a single word of warning to me. He had weaponized the trust I blindly handed him. I thanked the manager for the update, gripped the worn steering wheel tight, and drove through the opening gates. I parked my truck near the main loading dock, bracing myself for whatever destruction I was about to witness inside that concrete corridor. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I slowly walked down the long concrete corridor toward my assigned unit. The heavy metallic sounds of dragging and violent scraping echoed loudly off the bare cinder block walls. I turned the corner and immediately froze in my tracks. A massive commercial junk removal dumpster sat parked right outside the wide-open rolling door of my secure unit. 3 men in dirty work uniforms were aggressively hauling out Naomi's beautiful hand-carved mahogany dining table. That table was the very first piece of authentic furniture I ever bought for her after my logistics firm successfully landed its first major municipal contract. It was the exact table where we celebrated Devin's high school graduation and shared countless intimate family meals. Now it was being recklessly handled like discarded firewood. Devin stood near the sharp edge of the dumpster wearing his expensive designer winter coat, casually directing the hired crew. I stepped forward just enough to hear his cold voice echoing down the hall. He loudly instructed the workers to toss the antique pieces directly into the metal bin without worrying about any scratches or dents. He explicitly told the foreman that the items were nothing but worthless garbage taking up highly valuable real estate. Devin proudly declared that he urgently needed the entire storage unit emptied by noon to store Natalie's new luxury Pilates equipment. Her high-end exercise machines were apparently far more important than the sacred artifacts of the woman who gave him life. He watched the heavy mahogany table crash violently against the rusted steel bottom of the dumpster. The dark wood splintered with a sickening definitive crack. My son did not flinch or show a single ounce of remorse for his actions. He stood there firmly prioritizing his arrogant wife's superficial fitness routine over the preservation of his own rich family history. I stood silently in the deep shadows of the concrete hallway, feeling the icy sting of profound moral betrayal sink directly into my bones. The physical pain of watching Naomi's cherished belongings get systematically destroyed was agonizing, but the psychological blow of witnessing my son's sheer cruelty was infinitely worse. A younger, more volatile version of myself would have immediately charged down that corridor and physically thrown those workers away from my property. I would have grabbed Devin firmly by the collar and forcefully demanded he show some basic respect for his deceased mother's memory. But decades of navigating the ruthless corporate world had taught me the supreme value of absolute emotional restraint. Shouting matches only provide the enemy with unnecessary ammunition and critical forewarning. True power requires intense patience and calculated observation. I did not step out into the harsh fluorescent light. I did not physically intervene to save the splintered table. I forced myself to stand perfectly still and endure the horrific spectacle unfolding before me. I watched my son casually disrespect everything his mother stood for, allowing his true character to be fully exposed in the harsh light of his own unchecked greed. His utter lack of sentimentality definitively confirmed that he was entirely beyond conventional redemption. I reached into the inner pocket of my wool coat and pulled out my smartphone. I slowly zoomed the camera lens past Devin's shoulder and focused directly on the junk removal truck. I took a clear, high-resolution photograph of the commercial license plate and the company logo printed on the side of the vehicle. I captured the undeniable visual proof of his unauthorized destruction. I lowered the phone, possessing all the necessary evidence to execute my next maneuver. I needed to legally ensure this was the last time he ever touched my assets. I turned my back on my son and walked straight down the long concrete corridor toward the main exit. I did not look back as the heavy metal doors of the facility slammed shut behind me. I climbed into the freezing cab of my rusted pickup truck and started the engine. The time for passive observation had officially ended forever. I dialed the private direct number of Gregory, my personal wealth management attorney. Gregory was a ruthless, terrifyingly precise legal mind who had handled the most aggressive corporate acquisitions for my former logistics empire. He answered the phone on the second ring with his usual cold efficiency. I bypassed all basic pleasantries and immediately ordered him to initiate absolute legal retaliation against Devin and Natalie. I instructed him to mobilize the full crushing weight of my hidden resources to corner them financially and legally. I wanted a comprehensive audit of their specific vulnerabilities and a swift execution of maximum consequences for the profound property damage I had just witnessed. Gregory typed rapidly on his mechanical keyboard, confirming he was already drafting the necessary civil injunctions. Suddenly, the rhythmic tapping of his keys stopped dead. His breathing shifted slightly over the speaker. Gregory informed me that he had simultaneously run a routine security scan on the county public property registry while we were speaking. He delivered a piece of news that violently escalated the stakes of our impending war. He stated that Natalie had just uploaded a fresh real estate listing less than an hour ago. She had officially listed my $2 million suburban estate for an immediate fast cash sale online, fraudulently marketing the beautiful property as if she and Devin were the sole legitimate title holders. They were actively attempting to rapidly liquidate a house they did not legally own to quietly pocket millions. The air inside Gregory's corner office felt sterile and uncompromisingly cold. Frost framed the high windows overlooking the downtown skyline, matching the absolute freezing reality of the betrayal I was currently managing. Gregory stood at the head of the dark walnut conference table, an impeccably dressed legal architect who functioned entirely on facts and consequences. He pressed a button on his remote and the massive wall monitor hummed to life. He projected a highly active online real estate listing directly onto the glowing screen. I stared at the vibrant high-definition photographs of the suburban estate I had purchased with my own quiet labor. Natalie was marketing the multi-million-dollar property with staggering aggression. The listing boasted about the pristine architectural details, the sprawling gourmet kitchen, and the lushly manicured winter gardens. However, my eyes locked immediately onto the specific description featured prominently in bold text right beneath the primary photo gallery. Natalie proudly highlighted the newly cleared basement, advertising it as a massive, fully renovated blank canvas ready for a private fitness studio or a luxury home theater. She completely erased my existence from the very foundation of the home. She had aggressively sanitized the space where I had silently endured her endless insults. The sheer audacity of her public marketing campaign demonstrated a breathtaking level of greed. She was eagerly inviting strangers to walk through the hallways and bid on a stolen sanctuary. Gregory folded his hands and watched my face, waiting for an emotional reaction that I definitively refused to provide. I simply absorbed the visual confirmation of their profound arrogance. They honestly believed they had completely conquered me. They assumed the old man they threw into the blizzard had simply vanished into the shadows, leaving his immense wealth entirely unprotected and entirely ready for their immediate financial plundering. Gregory tapped his polished screen twice, shifting the display directly into the secure digital archives of the county property records. The bright, colorful real estate advertisement vanished instantly, replaced by the stark black and white reality of a highly illegal federal document. Devin had aggressively uploaded a completely forged quitclaim deed, officially transferring my absolute ownership of the entire estate exclusively to himself. I stepped closer to the glowing wall monitor and meticulously examined the criminal paperwork. The document falsely declared that I had willingly surrendered the massive property for the negligible sum of $1 single. I focused my vision tightly on the bottom right corner of the final page. My son had boldly attempted to replicate my distinct signature on the binding legal transfer. I observed the incredibly sloppy, desperate imitation of my personal handwriting currently projected onto the digital screen. The loops were entirely wrong. The pressure points lacked my usual heavy restraint, and the letters visibly trembled with undeniable panic. Devon had clearly signed this fraudulent document in a profound rush of sheer financial desperation. He possessed zero legal claim to the house, but his absolute entitlement convinced him he could easily steal it without triggering a massive investigation. He stupidly believed that his father was merely a pathetic ghost, entirely incapable of challenging his newfound authority. The sheer magnitude of his felony offense hung heavily in the freezing office air. My own flesh and blood had eagerly crossed the definitive line separating simple moral failure from absolute criminal liability. He had deliberately committed a severe federal crime to permanently satisfy his wife's unquenchable material greed. I stared at the pathetic forgery for a long moment, internalizing the irreversible destruction of his personal integrity while simultaneously recognizing the tremendous strategic advantage he just carelessly handed to me today. Gregory swiftly closed the digital property archives and opened a direct communication channel to the local district attorney. He reached for his desk phone, fully prepared to file an immediate police report for undisputed felony fraud. Gregory operated with merciless speed, seeking to arrest Devon before the house could be physically shown to any potential buyers. I slowly raised my right hand, firmly signaling for my aggressive attorney to completely stop his current actions. Gregory paused, his finger hovering directly over the flashing, illuminated dial button. He looked at me with genuine confusion, silently questioning why I would intentionally delay the absolute legal destruction of a man who just stole my entire house. I instructed Gregory to let the fraudulent real estate sale proceed entirely uninterrupted. I did not want a simple preliminary fraud charge that could be easily reduced by a sympathetic judge or blamed on a mere administrative error. I wanted an ironclad, inescapable federal conviction. I explicitly ordered my attorney to let Devon and Natalie publicly market the stolen property, successfully secure a completely legitimate buyer, and proceed directly into the final escrow stage. I wanted them to digitally sign the closing documents, permanently tying their legal identities to a massive financial crime. Allowing them to fully execute their incredibly arrogant master plan would ensure absolute maximum criminal liability. They needed to actively attempt to cash the massive stolen funds before the authorities intervened. Gregory slowly lowered his phone, a sharp, terrifying smile forming perfectly across his usually stoic face. He instantly understood the profound brutality of my highly calculated strategy. We were not simply going to stop them from stealing the sprawling suburban estate. We were going to actively help them build the very federal prison cell they would occupy for the next 20 long years. I remained standing near the digital monitor, observing the falsely confident listing Natalie had so proudly posted. I turned back to Gregory and explicitly instructed him to utilize one of my anonymous corporate shell companies. My heavy logistics empire had required several discrete holding entities over the decades to purchase massive commercial warehouses without triggering market inflation. I owned a perfectly clean, highly secure, untraceable corporate firm registered in Delaware that existed solely on paper. I directly ordered Gregory to use this specific entity to interact directly with Natalie. She was desperately hunting for a ridiculously fast cash sale to fund her outrageously expensive lifestyle and clear whatever secret debts she undoubtedly carried. We were going to hand her the exact golden ticket she so deeply craved. I watched as Gregory sat down at his sleek computer terminal, rapidly navigating through his secure legal portals. He immediately drafted a flawless, full-price cash offer for the $2 million suburban estate using the completely untraceable shell company. He completely waived all the standard preliminary inspections, effectively removing any potential hurdles that could possibly delay her immediate acceptance. He structured the extremely aggressive offer to look like an incredibly wealthy, highly motivated corporate investor seeking a rapid portfolio expansion. Gregory hit the final submission key, sending the binding financial document directly into Natalie's digital inbox. We were aggressively baiting the ultimate legal trap for Devon and his incredibly arrogant wife. They were currently celebrating their brilliant deception, entirely unaware that the massive corporation preparing to buy their stolen house was entirely controlled by the very same man they had just banished into the freezing blizzard. Gregory instantly checked the public registry again and calmly informed me that Natalie had literally just received our aggressive cash offer directly online this very exact second right now. Natalie stood at the gleaming glass checkout counter of the most exclusive designer boutique in the city center. Her posture radiated an overwhelming sense of unearned superiority. She tapped her manicured acrylic nails impatiently against the pristine display case, treating the seasoned sales associate like an incompetent servant. Two newly released limited edition luxury handbags rested gracefully on the velvet countermat before her. These genuine leather accessories were the absolute centerpieces of her upcoming highly anticipated winter wardrobe. She fully intended to flaunt these ridiculously expensive items during her luxury getaway to Aspen, entirely oblivious to the fact that her entire trip had just been systematically dismantled. Natalie retrieved a heavy premium metal credit card from her designer purse and aggressively slapped it down onto the glass counter. She offered a remarkably condescending smile, silently demanding immediate service and unwavering admiration from everyone standing nearby. She loudly bragged to another wealthy customer about her impending vacation, describing the exclusive mountain chalet she falsely believed she was still destined to occupy. Her entire identity hinged completely on the visible consumption of immense wealth. She thrived on projecting a flawless image of effortless financial dominance. The young cashier politely picked up the heavy metal card, completely unaware of the massive financial detonation quietly waiting to explode. Natalie crossed her arms and stared intently at the sleek digital card reader. She expected the usual smooth approval, the familiar printing of the long receipt, and the immediate surrender of her heavily branded shopping bags. She thrived entirely on the toxic adrenaline rush of impulsive retail therapy, viewing extravagant purchases as her absolute right. She lifted her chin, inhaling the heavily perfumed air of the boutique, utterly convinced of her own untouchable invincibility and completely ignoring the impending disaster heading her absolute way right now. The sophisticated card machine beeped loudly with a sharp, unpleasant tone that pierced the elegant quiet of the designer boutique. The digital display flashed an unavoidable message. The expensive luxury transaction was firmly declined. Natalie blinked in absolute shock, her perfectly crafted facade slipping for a brief second. She quickly recovered her arrogant posture and glared furiously at the terrified young cashier. She sternly blamed the employee for operating the machine incorrectly. She loudly demanded the nervous woman run the premium card a second time, raising her voice enough to draw the immediate attention of every other wealthy shopper in the store. The heavy silence of the boutique amplified her embarrassing public outburst. Natalie aggressively insisted her credit limit was practically infinite, claiming her husband held a massive corporate position that guaranteed absolute financial security. She vehemently ordered the cashier to manually bypass the error, completely refusing to accept the undeniable reality of the digital rejection. The terrified employee quickly swiped the heavy metal card through the electronic reader, once again her hands trembling under Natalie's fierce, unyielding scrutiny. The machine processed the secure data for a few agonizing seconds before emitting another harsh, negative beep. This time, the brightly lit screen displayed a glaring red notice that illuminated the dark glass counter. The system boldly declared all associated funds were entirely frozen by the primary account holder. The harsh red letters explicitly stated that no further transactions would be authorized under any circumstances. Natalie stared at the digital screen in utter disbelief. The color drained entirely from her face as the profound public humiliation settled deeply into her bones. The other elite customers actively watched her spectacular downfall, openly whispering about the sudden disruption. Her precious luxury handbags remained firmly positioned behind the checkout counter, permanently out of her reach. Natalie stormed out of the high-end boutique and viciously dialed Devon's phone number. She completely ignored the bitter cold wind biting at her expensive designer clothes. When Devon finally answered, she unleashed a torrent of frantic, humiliating rage directly into the receiver. She loudly accused him of gross financial incompetence, publicly screaming that his pathetic inability to manage basic accounts had just subjected her to ultimate social destruction. She demanded to know why his supposedly limitless premium credit line had forcefully rejected her simple transaction. Her shrill voice echoed down the crowded metropolitan sidewalk, berating him for failing to maintain the luxurious lifestyle she fundamentally required. Devon sat paralyzed at his corporate desk, his face burning hot with intense shame as her venomous insults completely shattered his fragile ego. He scrambled to open his secure mobile banking application, desperately praying for a simple technical glitch or a minor server error. His trembling thumb tapped the illuminated screen, rapidly navigating past his standard checking accounts to locate the massive joint emergency credit fund. The digital interface loaded the confidential financial data with agonizing slowness. Devin stared blankly at the bright screen, his breath catching painfully in his tight throat. The previously overflowing credit line was entirely erased from his personal profile. The once immense safety net he had secretly abused for years was completely eradicated without a single warning notification. The bold black numbers prominently displaying his current available balance read absolute zero. He frantically refreshed the encrypted banking application multiple times, stubbornly refusing to accept the catastrophic reality unfolding before his eyes. The immense wealth he had ruthlessly stolen from his father had vanished into thin air. He was entirely broke, hopelessly drowning in secret liabilities and completely tethered to a furious woman demanding immediate and expensive answers right now. Devin forcefully and angrily terminated the humiliating phone call and completely refused to comprehend the devastating financial truth. His deeply entrenched arrogance convinced him that his pathetic, uneducated father had simply run out of his meager pension funds and accidentally triggered a temporary bank freeze. He stubbornly assumed Cyrus was completely broke and genuinely struggling to survive the harsh winter conditions. Devin grabbed his heavy car keys, absolutely determined to confront his weak father and verbally demand he fix the annoying banking error immediately. He drove his luxury sedan rapidly through the freezing, snow-covered city streets, heading directly toward the dangerous side of town. He pulled up to the run-down, state-run homeless shelter Natalie had cruelly provided on her printed list the previous night. Devin aggressively marched through the battered front doors, utterly disgusted by the stark poverty surrounding him. He confidently approached the exhausted shelter director sitting behind a chipped wooden desk. Devin loudly demanded to see his destitute father, expecting Cyrus to be shivering helplessly in a crowded communal room. The seasoned director slowly checked the official digital registry, shaking his head with absolute certainty. He firmly informed Devin that no one named Cyrus had ever stepped foot inside their charitable facility. Confusion and rising panic suddenly gripped Devin's chest as he marched quickly back to his warm vehicle. He drove randomly through the slick metropolitan streets, completely unable to locate the pathetic old man he had so easily discarded. He eventually turned his car down an incredibly exclusive avenue lined with towering commercial glass buildings. Devin suddenly slammed on his expensive brakes, his eyes widening in complete shock. He clearly spotted his father's distinctive, rusted pickup truck parked perfectly outside the gleaming corporate headquarters of the city's most elite, terrifyingly effective private investigation firm right across town. I sat across the heavy oak desk in Dominic's dimly lit downtown office. The blinds were drawn tight against the winter glare, casting long, sharp shadows across the room. Dominic was a highly skilled private investigator I had retained years ago during my corporate logistics days to vet potential business partners. He operated entirely in the shadows, delivering flawless intelligence with absolute discretion. He did not offer empty pleasantries or a warm cup of coffee. He simply reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a remarkably thick black folder. He slid the heavy dossier smoothly across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of my hands. He leaned back in his leather chair and stated that the contents would permanently alter my understanding of my daughter-in-law. I opened the heavy cover. The first page displayed a comprehensive summary of Natalie's highly guarded secret financial life. Dominic explained that her projected image of effortless wealth was a meticulously constructed, fraudulent illusion. The documents presented a stark, undeniable reality that shattered the arrogant facade she displayed at the suburban estate. Her entire existence was built on a crumbling foundation of massive, unsustainable liabilities. She demanded perfection and luxury while actively driving her marriage into absolute financial ruin. I slowly turned the pages, absorbing the staggering scale of her deception. She had spent years actively hiding the truth from Devin, manipulating his perception of their financial stability to maintain her lavish lifestyle. Dominic sat silently, allowing the raw data to speak for itself. The crisp, printed numbers revealed a horrifying pattern of reckless, impulsive consumption, completely divorced from their actual household income. The dossier represented the definitive weapon I needed to aggressively dismantle their fraudulent narrative and absolutely expose the sheer undeniable hypocrisy of their Christmas Eve eviction. Dominic tapped a manicured finger against a thick stack of aggressively highlighted bank statements. He bluntly revealed that Natalie currently carried over $100,000 in highly toxic secret credit card debt. The staggering figure was entirely composed of high-interest revolving accounts she had systematically opened without Devon's knowledge or formal consent. She financed her designer wardrobe exclusive spa memberships and imported home decor purely through a chaotic web of extreme borrowing. Dominic flipped to a secondary section containing extremely alarming legal correspondence. He explained that multiple aggressive debt collection agencies were actively pursuing her for immediate repayment. To deliberately keep Devon completely in the dark regarding her impending financial collapse, Natalie had discreetly opened a private post office box on the opposite side of the city. She systematically redirected all the final collection notices, threatening legal warnings and past due billing statements directly to that untraceable address. She intercepted the inevitable financial disaster before it could ever breach the pristine mailbox of their suburban estate. I stared at the irrefutable evidence of her intense calculated deceit. She aggressively criticized my simple, frugal existence, while she fundamentally functioned as a walking financial catastrophe. Her staggering hypocrisy generated a profound, icy rage directly within my chest. She was perfectly willing to violently evict her own father-in-law into a freezing blizzard simply to secure a desperately needed cash infusion. Her sudden urgency to sell my massive house was not driven by an arrogant desire for a private yoga studio. It was entirely fueled by an absolute terrifying panic. She desperately needed to rapidly liquidate my valuable property to successfully pay off her many hidden creditors before her secret financial empire completely imploded and totally destroyed her fragile marriage, thereby exposing her endless, incredibly toxic lies forever to the absolute entire world. Dominic allowed me a brief moment to process Natalie's deception before dropping a second, infinitely more destructive bombshell directly onto the desk. He pulled out a specialized manila envelope sealed with red confidential tape. He explicitly stated that Devon was not merely an ignorant victim of his wife's staggering financial incompetence. Devon was actively orchestrating a massive, highly illegal embezzlement scheme within his own corporate logistics firm to desperately cover Natalie's relentlessly mounting liabilities. Dominic extracted a series of stunningly clear, high-resolution photographs taken covertly inside Devon's executive office. The undeniable images showed my son late at night aggressively altering the primary corporate accounting ledgers on his dual monitors. Dominic had successfully intercepted the raw digital data streams, providing irrefutable proof that Devon was systematically siphoning thousands of dollars from his employer's operational budget directly into a hidden offshore transit account. My son had completely abandoned every single ethical principle I had painstakingly instilled in him during his youth. He was actively risking a lengthy federal prison sentence simply to maintain the pathetic illusion of suburban wealth and appease a woman who fundamentally viewed him as a highly disposable utility. I stared closely at the crisp photographs, observing the deep sweat staining Devon's collar as he manipulated the complex spreadsheets. He was a deeply terrified man, hopelessly trapped inside a collapsing criminal enterprise of his own making. He had utterly destroyed his promising professional career to artificially inflate his wife's insatiable ego. Dominic calmly explained that the corporate auditors were entirely unaware of the missing funds, meaning we currently possess the exclusive power to unilaterally trigger his immediate corporate termination and subsequent criminal prosecution. My very own flesh and blood had eagerly chosen to become a desperate corporate thief rather than honestly confronting his wildly toxic marriage problems right now. I sat in total silence, staring intensely at the visual proof of my son's absolute, undeniable moral collapse. The sheer magnitude of his illegal activities completely eradicated any lingering paternal sympathy I might have harbored. He was no longer a misguided child making simple relationship mistakes. He was an active, willing participant in a massive federal crime designed solely to rob his corporate employer and protect a violently greedy spouse. Dominic recognized the cold shift in my demeanor and reached for his specialized digital recording device. He placed the small metallic speaker directly in the absolute center of the polished desk. He stated that there was one final piece of intelligence I urgently needed to hear before authorizing the definitive counterattack. Dominic pressed the glowing green button, playing a flawlessly intercepted, crystal-clear phone conversation between Devon and Natalie recorded just hours after my Christmas Eve eviction. On the crisp audio, Natalie's voice sounded incredibly sharp and frantic. She aggressively told Devon they could not afford to wait for the standard escrow procedures to clear the forged house deed. She loudly insisted they must officially declare me legally insane and totally incompetent through a rapid medical injunction. She specifically stated that securing a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation was the only reliable method to immediately seize full administrative control over my remaining assets, drastically expedite the lucrative house sale, and permanently avoid an impending federal tax audit on Devon's stolen corporate income. They were actively conspiring to utterly destroy my legal autonomy and lock me inside a severe psychiatric ward. The malicious audio recording officially transformed my quiet financial adjustment into a ruthless, fully justified war of absolute survival. The ultimate checkmate was now fully required to completely obliterate their incredibly sinister, profoundly evil master plot permanently right now in this room. Devon and Natalie recognized that a standard eviction process would require months of agonizing legal delays they absolutely could not afford. They needed a rapid, undisputed mechanism to instantly seize complete administrative control over my entire life and rapidly expedite the fraudulent house sale. Their sinister solution involved hiring a thoroughly disgraced local psychiatrist who possessed a notorious reputation for providing highly questionable medical diagnoses to the highest bidder. Dominic had already flagged this specific doctor in his comprehensive dossier. The man had quietly lost his prestigious hospital privileges years ago due to severe ethical violations regarding prescription kickbacks. Natalie aggressively tracked him down and arranged a highly secretive meeting at a discreet location outside the city limits. She and Devon paid the corrupt physician a massive sum of unrecorded cash, completely bypassing all standard medical billing channels to avoid generating a paper trail. In exchange for the illegal envelope of thick bills, the morally bankrupt doctor agreed to draft a highly damaging preliminary medical report, formally declaring that I suffered from advanced severe dementia. This fabricated document would legally establish that I possessed absolutely no cognitive capacity to manage my own financial affairs or challenge a property transfer. They intended to wield this weaponized psychiatric evaluation to easily convince a probate judge to grant Devon absolute legal guardianship. They believed that officially slapping a permanent medically certified label of profound insanity onto my permanent record would magically erase all their problems and secure their stolen millions. They fundamentally assumed I was entirely unaware of their terrifyingly cruel machinations. They crafted this despicable legal trap with breathtaking arrogance, actively plotting to entirely strip away my fundamental human rights while casually spending the illicit corporate funds Devon was recklessly stealing from his increasingly suspicious employer every single working day without fail. The very next morning, I decided to maintain my usual public routine to avoid raising any immediate suspicions. I sat comfortably at my favorite corner booth inside a quiet local diner, sipping black coffee and casually reading the morning newspaper. The small bell above the glass door chimed loudly, cutting through the gentle hum of breakfast conversations. I lowered my newspaper and watched Devon walk inside, accompanied by an unfamiliar, nervous man clutching a worn leather briefcase. My son desperately scanned the room before his eyes locked directly onto my booth. He marched aggressively toward my table with the disgraced psychiatrist following closely behind him like a frightened shadow. They slid into the vinyl seats across from me without bothering to ask for permission or offering a basic greeting. Devon immediately launched into a highly rehearsed speech expressing deep, fabricated concern for my declining mental faculties. He introduced the sweating man sitting beside him as a highly respected medical specialist who generously agreed to conduct an informal psychological evaluation right there at the diner table. They essentially attempted to ambush me in a public setting, hoping the sheer social pressure would prevent me from causing a defensive scene. The corrupt doctor quickly pulled a yellow notepad from his briefcase and began firing off a series of deliberately confusing baiting questions designed to trigger an emotional or disjointed response. He continuously asked me to verify random dates, recount specific financial details, and confirm basic historical facts while feverishly scribbling notes. They genuinely believed their sudden, aggressive tactics would easily overwhelm an uneducated elderly man and provide the exact, disorganized answers they desperately needed to validate their fraudulent dementia diagnosis. I let them perform their incredibly pathetic theatrical routine for several uninterrupted minutes before deciding to systematically dismantle their entire amateur operation. I remained perfectly calm and utterly composed throughout their entirely transparent psychological ambush. I did not raise my voice or display a single ounce of expected elderly confusion. I simply folded my morning newspaper deliberately and placed it neatly beside my warm coffee mug. I stared directly into the sweating doctor's darting eyes and proceeded to answer every single one of his ridiculous baiting questions with sharp, calculated precision. I recited complex numerical sequences, confirmed exact dates from decades past, and articulated my current financial standing with an intimidating level of absolute clarity. The psychiatrist visibly faltered as my articulate responses completely destroyed the flimsy narrative Devin had carefully constructed. He nervously tapped his ballpoint pen against the yellow notepad, realizing he was failing to extract any usable evidence of mental decline. I leaned slightly forward across the diner table, closing the physical distance between us to assert total dominance over the tense situation. I reached smoothly into the inner breast pocket of my tailored winter jacket. I extracted a crisp white business card and slid it slowly across the smooth tabletop until it rested directly beneath the doctor's trembling hands. The small printed card did not belong to me. It belonged to a senior federal investigator working directly for the state medical licensing board. Dominic had specifically obtained this invaluable contact during his extensive background check on the disgraced physician. I calmly informed the terrified man that this particular investigator was currently building a massive criminal case regarding his illegal prescription kickbacks. I suggested that actively participating in a fraudulent conspiracy to falsely declare a perfectly healthy senior citizen legally insane might expedite his impending prison sentence. The sheer paralyzing terror spreading across his face confirmed my absolute victory over their pathetic, desperate, and incredibly foolish little trap today. The corrupt psychiatrist turned completely pale as the blood rapidly drained from his terrified face. The sheer realization that he was actively sitting across from a highly resourceful target utterly destroyed his false confidence. He frantically shoved his blank yellow notepad and his expensive pen back into his worn leather briefcase with intensely trembling hands. He did not utter a single word of explanation or offer a basic apology to his highly paying clients. He abruptly slid out of the narrow vinyl booth and practically sprinted toward the diner exit, abandoning Devin completely without any hesitation. The glass door swung shut behind the fleeing man, leaving my son sitting alone in an ocean of profound, awkward silence. Devin stared blankly at the empty space beside him, completely incapable of processing the spectacular failure of his incredibly sinister scheme. He looked back at me, searching my stoic expression for any sign of paternal weakness or impending forgiveness. He found absolutely nothing but cold, unyielding resolve. I did not gloat over my obvious tactical victory or deliver a dramatic concluding speech. I simply lifted my ceramic mug, took one final satisfying sip of my warm black coffee, and stood up from the booth. I walked out of the establishment, leaving him to pay the breakfast bill alone. My graceful departure plunged him into a terrifyingly deep state of sheer, absolute desperation. The massive corporate embezzlement and Natalie's crushing hidden debts were relentlessly suffocating his fragile marriage. He urgently needed the massive cash infusion from the pending real estate transaction to survive his impending ruin. Blinded by overwhelming greed and sheer reckless panic, Devin made a catastrophically stupid decision right there. He aggressively decided to proceed entirely with the forged deed regardless of the missing medical report tonight without any further delay whatsoever. Sunday afternoon arrived with a brilliant, blinding winter sun reflecting off the pristine snowbanks surrounding my aggressively marketed suburban estate. Natalie had transformed the expansive property into a lavish, high-society theatrical production designed to rapidly finalize the fraudulent sale. She orchestrated a massive influx of wealthy potential buyers, corporate agents, and curious neighborhood elite, packing the grand foyer with heavily perfumed strangers. The sheer arrogance of her display was nauseatingly impressive. She stood at the absolute center of the sprawling living room, functioning as the grand hostess of a stolen empire. She enthusiastically handed out delicate crystal flutes brimming with incredibly expensive imported champagne to anyone who crossed her path. Her shrill musical laughter completely dominated the ambient noise as she seamlessly guided investors through the immaculate corridors. She aggressively bragged to the affluent guests about her exquisite, visionary taste in luxury home renovations, falsely claiming she had personally designed every single architectural upgrade present in the house. She enthusiastically pointed toward the custom crown molding and the imported hardwood floors, taking absolute credit for the decades of grueling silent labor I had personally invested into the physical structure. She treated the open house as a glorious coronation, a definitive public celebration of her ultimate financial triumph over a man she considered entirely erased from existence. Devin hovered nervously near the front entryway, occasionally checking his vibrating smartphone with intensely sweating hands. He knew the forged property deed was highly vulnerable without the medical competency report, But Natalie's insatiable greed demanded this immediate, highly public liquidation. She simply refused to wait. She glided through the spacious dining room, radiating an incredibly toxic confidence, entirely convinced that her brilliant, ruthless manipulation had permanently secured her luxurious future and effectively buried my entire legacy under a massive mountain of deceitful paperwork. I stepped calmly through the towering mahogany front doors, completely bypassing the busy real estate agent frantically organizing colorful brochures on the entryway table. I did not resemble the exhausted, defeated old man they had violently thrown into the harsh winter elements just weeks ago. I was dressed flawlessly in a sharp, incredibly expensive custom-tailored suit woven from dark charcoal wool. A pristine white shirt and a deep crimson silk tie perfectly accented my broad shoulders, visibly projecting undeniable corporate authority and unyielding financial power. I carried a heavy polished mahogany walking cane adorned with a brilliantly gleaming silver tip, striking the marble floor with a rhythmic, authoritative cadence that echoed steadily down the crowded hallway. The rhythmic tapping sliced sharply through the loud background chatter, subtly parting the dense sea of affluent buyers as I steadily advanced into the very heart of my own stolen home. I moved with the absolute terrifying confidence of a man who held the undisputed legal keys to the entire kingdom. I deliberately paused near the grand staircase, allowing the sharp scent of my expensive cologne to mingle effortlessly with the boutique floral arrangements Natalie had scattered around the vast room. Several curious guests glanced respectfully in my direction, instantly recognizing the unmistakable aura of profound, deeply entrenched wealth. They naturally assumed I was a massive corporate investor or a highly prestigious buyer, arriving to forcefully close the lucrative deal. Natalie was completely engrossed in her own pathetic theatrical performance directly across the expansive room. She stood facing the massive gourmet kitchen, gesturing wildly toward the expensive imported granite countertops. From her disadvantaged vantage point, she only saw my broad back and immaculate tailoring. She absolutely did not recognize the formidable silhouette standing proudly within her stolen sanctuary, completely unnoticed in plain sight today. I stepped silently across the gleaming hardwood floor, positioning myself perfectly near the massive marble kitchen island. Natalie remained entirely focused on a wealthy older couple currently admiring the expensive custom cabinetry. I stood completely still, leaning casually against my silver-tipped walking cane, silently observing her increasingly aggressive sales pitch. She enthusiastically offered the affluent couple more premium champagne, her voice practically dripping with incredibly fake sweetness. The curious buyers casually asked her about the property's extensive history and the specific reasons behind this sudden, highly urgent liquidation sale. Natalie offered a deeply theatrical sigh, expertly pasting a profoundly fake expression of deep, sympathetic sorrow across her sharply manicured face. She loudly informed the potential buyers that the previous owner was a completely pathetic, hopelessly senile old man who had tragically lost his brittle mind. She brazenly lied to their faces, claiming her poor father-in-law had become a severe physical danger to himself and required immediate forced relocation into a highly secure, heavily guarded state psychiatric facility. She casually dismissed my entire existence as a mere unfortunate medical burden that she and Devon had generously managed to resolve for the ultimate benefit of the surrounding affluent community. The sheer malice radiating from her practiced venomous lies was absolutely staggering to witness firsthand. She possessed absolutely zero remorse for the profound cruelty she had so eagerly inflicted upon me. I gripped the smooth silver handle of my heavy cane, tightly feeling the cold metal press firmly into my steady palm. I slowly rotated my body, turning deliberately around to face her directly. I locked my sharp, unwavering gaze straight into her deceitful eyes, utterly destroying her pathetic theatrical performance with my terrifyingly silent, incredibly dominant, and undeniably permanent physical presence standing right there in front of her panicked face right now. The vibrant color drained completely from Natalie's sharply contoured face the exact microsecond her arrogant eyes finally registered my imposing presence. The incredibly fragile crystal champagne flute instantly slipped from her trembling manicured hand, crashing violently against the expensive imported marble floor. The sharp, explosive sound of shattering glass violently pierced the sophisticated ambiance of the sprawling room, instantly drawing the confused attention of every single wealthy guest present. The sweet, bubbling liquid splashed wildly across the pristine floorboards, mirroring the sudden catastrophic destruction of her carefully maintained fraudulent public image. She stood absolutely paralyzed behind the kitchen island, staring at me as if a buried corpse had just proudly resurrected itself in her pristine kitchen. Her lips parted slightly, but her terrified throat completely failed to produce even a single coherent syllable. I stepped forward with calculated, agonizing slowness, effortlessly closing the remaining distance between us. I offered her a terrifyingly cold, utterly merciless smile that instantly communicated her absolute impending doom. I smoothly reached inside my tailored jacket pocket and extracted the sleek black corporate business card belonging entirely to the anonymous Delaware holding firm. I extended my steady hand and placed the crisp rectangular card deliberately onto the granite counter right in front of her shaking fingers. I calmly stated in a clear, resonant voice that I personally represented the massive corporate investment group currently purchasing this exact property. I effectively revealed that the incredibly aggressive cash offer she had so eagerly accepted was actually funded entirely by my own immense hidden wealth. Would this profound revelation finally force my completely cornered, thoroughly humiliated daughter-in-law to legally surrender the fraudulent deed, or would her incredibly toxic desperation push her toward committing an even darker, vastly more dangerous federal crime against me before the night was truly over? Natalie stared at the matte black corporate business card resting on the cold granite countertop as if it were highly radioactive. Her initial shock instantly morphed into a frantic and entirely unhinged panic. She practically lunged across the wide marble island, grabbed Devin by the tailored collar of his expensive designer shirt, and aggressively dragged him straight into the secluded catering kitchen, tucked right behind the main dining area. The heavy swinging door slammed shut momentarily, muffling the chaotic murmurs of the wealthy guests who had just witnessed her spectacular public humiliation. I remained perfectly stationary in the grand foyer, using my heightened senses to track their frantic movements. Through the narrow crack in the swinging door, I clearly heard Natalie unleashing a vicious and hysterical tirade against her bewildered husband. She loudly claimed that I was operating on pure vindictive spite, aggressively asserting that I had completely lost my brittle mind. She desperately tried to convince Devin that I was illegally impersonating a legitimate corporate agent simply to ruin her highly anticipated real estate transaction. Her shrill voice echoed against the stainless steel appliances, vibrating with sheer, unchecked desperation. She vehemently demanded that Devin immediately confront his pathetic delusional father and forcefully remove me from the pristine property before my disruptive presence permanently scared away any other potential corporate investors. Devin stood utterly paralyzed against the industrial refrigerator, sweating profusely under the crushing weight of her impossible demands. He knew exactly what I was truly capable of, yet his suffocating fear of his wife completely overrode his basic survival instincts. He foolishly nodded his head, blindly agreeing to handle the impossible situation while actively suppressing the terrifying realization that his entire fraudulent empire was currently collapsing directly onto his incredibly arrogant head right now at this very exact moment. Natalie realized that throwing me out of the house physically would not erase the extensive damage I had already inflicted upon her pristine social reputation. She needed to preemptively destroy my personal credibility before I could publicly expose her catastrophic financial ruin. She aggressively grabbed her smartphone and immediately logged onto the highly exclusive neighborhood community forum. This private digital platform served as the absolute epicenter of suburban gossip for the affluent local residents. She began rapidly typing a detailed and highly fabricated story, weaponizing her false victimhood with staggering efficiency. She maliciously posted a massive, completely unhinged narrative, claiming that her deeply disturbed elderly father had tragically suffered a violent psychotic break. She falsely asserted that I was currently stalking her family, aggressively harassing her wealthy guests, and illegally trespassing on her privately owned property. She painted an incredibly dark portrait of a completely senile, dangerous old man who desperately needed immediate police intervention and mandatory psychiatric confinement. Her venomous post deliberately aimed to socially assassinate my character, effectively turning the entire affluent community against me in a matter of mere minutes. She aggressively urged her wealthy neighbors to lock their doors and contact the local authorities if they spotted my distinct, tailored figure wandering through the snowy suburban streets. She pressed the submit button, permanently uploading her profound defamation directly onto the highly active digital network. She honestly believed that her incredibly toxic lies would generate a massive wave of absolute community sympathy and completely validate her impending efforts to forcefully lock me inside a severe psychiatric ward. She smiled a vicious, incredibly arrogant smile, absolutely certain that her digital smear campaign would successfully neutralize my very immediate threat and entirely protect her highly illegal real estate transaction from my aggressive corporate interference permanently and entirely tonight immediately. What Natalie entirely failed to comprehend was that Dominic had already positioned his elite digital surveillance software to monitor every single keystroke executing across the local networks. He possessed an incredible level of technological dominance that easily bypassed her simplistic neighborhood community forum security settings. Dominic intercepted the highly malicious digital posts, instantly successfully capturing her profound venom the exact second the fabricated data hit the primary server. He sat completely focused in his dark downtown office, quietly observing the massive flow of targeted defamation she was aggressively broadcasting into the affluent suburban community. He immediately engaged his secure tracking protocols, permanently recording the specific routing numbers connecting her personal smartphone directly to the incredibly toxic digital narrative. He rapidly captured pristine, high-resolution screenshots documenting every single vicious lie, completely preserving the exact timestamps and the irrefutable digital footprint. Dominic methodically compiled the raw digital data into a heavily encrypted evidentiary file, verifying that she had intentionally committed undeniable, fully documented libel against a highly prominent corporate figure. He did not hesitate to utilize this immense tactical advantage. He instantly forwarded the comprehensive defamation evidence directly into Gregory's secure legal inbox, ensuring my ruthless attorney possessed the absolute ammunition required for massive future litigation. Gregory received the pristine digital file with extreme satisfaction, immediately drafting a tremendously aggressive civil lawsuit guaranteed to completely strip Natalie of any remaining financial dignity. Her incredibly pathetic attempt to publicly assassinate my personal character had essentially handed my legal team the exact irrefutable evidence they urgently needed to completely destroy her entire life. Natalie believed she was fiercely protecting her fraudulent real estate empire, but she had actually just delivered the final devastating blow to her own wildly arrogant, completely inescapable financial doom right now at this very exact moment of absolute panic. While Natalie aggressively engaged in her frantic campaign of digital character assassination, Devin remained perfectly isolated inside his dimly lit corporate office across the city. His expensive smartphone suddenly vibrated against the polished desk, emitting a sharp, incredibly loud notification tone that completely shattered the heavy silence. He quickly snatched the device, desperately hoping for a miraculous banking update to mysteriously restore his frozen emergency funds. Instead, he stared directly at an extremely urgent, highly confidential email sent from the elite anonymous corporate buyer preparing to purchase my stolen suburban estate. The heavily encrypted message demanded immediate, absolutely uncompromising action. The incredibly wealthy investors firmly stated that their massive multi-million-dollar cash offer would permanently expire unless the final binding purchase contract was officially signed and fully notarized before exactly midnight tonight. The demanding email explicitly noted that the massive portfolio expansion funds were currently secured in escrow, but any sudden delay would instantly completely terminate the highly lucrative transaction forever. Devin felt a terrifying rush of sheer absolute panic squeeze his entirely desperate heart. He knew Natalie's hidden debts were actively suffocating his fragile marriage, and the missing medical competency report technically rendered this rapid real estate sale completely illegal. However, his profound greed and his overwhelming fear of ultimate financial ruin powerfully silenced any remaining shred of basic moral hesitation. He slowly opened his top desk drawer and pulled out the thick, meticulously prepared closing documents. He completely ignored the glaring legal absence of a legitimate psychological evaluation. He slowly reached across his wide desk and retrieved an expensive, heavy blue ink pen. Devin firmly gripped the cold metal barrel, eagerly preparing to physically commit the ultimate highly illegal federal forgery to officially steal my house and secure his incredibly dark financial salvation right now, late tonight. Devin paced the length of the sprawling living room, his expensive leather shoes echoing heavily against the imported hardwood floor. A thick layer of cold sweat completely coated his pale forehead. He had driven frantically back from the city center after spotting his father's rusted truck parked outside that elite private investigation firm. The terrifying implication of Cyrus actively retaining professional corporate security contractors severely rattled his fragile nerves. He desperately wanted to cancel everything and run, but the crushing weight of their massive hidden liabilities entirely eliminated retreat as a viable option. Natalie sat aggressively on the edge of the velvet sofa, glaring at her heavily panicked husband with absolute unyielding contempt. She completely ignored his frantic warnings about the private investigator. She violently pushed the thick corporate purchase agreement directly across the glass coffee table. The pristine white pages represented the ultimate golden ticket they so desperately required to survive. The anonymous corporate buyer was offering an astronomical full-price cash settlement with absolutely zero preliminary inspections or administrative contingencies. Natalie loudly reminded Devon that this massive cash infusion legally guaranteed their immediate escape from completely crippling debt and imminent public bankruptcy. She viciously calculated the exact total of her secret credit card balances and the corporate logistics funds Devon had illegally embezzled over the past 8 months. This single lucrative real estate transaction would instantaneously erase their entire criminal footprint and completely restore their fraudulent facade of immense suburban wealth. Devon abruptly stopped pacing and stared directly at the binding legal contract resting quietly on the table. The incredibly aggressive deadline demanded an immediate signature before midnight tonight. If they failed to execute the document immediately, the massive corporate investment firm would permanently withdraw their lucrative offer and completely abandon the pending sale forever entirely right now. Natalie forcefully commanded her terrified husband to immediately sit down and diligently practice his father's unique signature. She retrieved a blank yellow legal pad from the nearby mahogany desk and slammed it aggressively onto the glass surface directly beside the binding corporate contract. She ordered him to meticulously study the old birthday cards and faded holiday letters Cyrus had sent them over the past decade. Devon slowly collapsed onto the plush sofa cushions, feeling physically nauseated by the horrific gravity of the exact situation. He gingerly picked up a heavy black fountain pen, his entire arm visibly trembling under the massive, suffocating pressure of his incredibly dark choices. He cautiously pressed the sharp metal nib against the crisp yellow paper, attempting to accurately replicate the distinct authoritative cursive loops his father always utilized. His very first desperate attempt looked absolutely pathetic, completely lacking the steady, confident pressure Cyrus naturally applied to all official documents. Natalie aggressively hovered directly over his trembling shoulder, loudly criticizing every single minor flaw and viciously demanding absolute perfection. The incredibly heavy weight of undisputed federal fraud loomed ominously over his sweating head, threatening to permanently destroy his entire life. Devon swallowed hard, fully comprehending that successfully executing this specific forgery would instantly cross an invisible, completely irreversible moral boundary. He was no longer simply lying to his strict father. He was deliberately committing a highly sophisticated, massively illegal corporate crime designed specifically to steal millions of dollars. He squeezed his eyes shut, desperately, trying to block out the terrifying image of a cold federal prison cell. He opened his eyes, gripped the expensive fountain pen with fresh, utterly terrified determination, and slowly began tracing Cyrus's sacred name over and over again until the dark ink lines finally completely matched his old father's beautiful signature perfectly, right now today. After completely filling 4 separate pages with dark, frantic scribbles, Devon finally mastered the incredibly complex loops of his father's deeply distinct signature. He took a massive, shuddering breath and pulled the official binding real estate contract directly toward his trembling chest. He hovered the heavy fountain pen directly over the final designated buyer signature line. The profound silence inside the sprawling living room felt completely deafening as he slowly lowered the sharp metal nib onto the pristine white document. Devon aggressively forced his shaking hand to remain perfectly steady, executing the fraudulent signature with incredibly precise, highly calculated strokes. He flawlessly forged Cyrus's exact name onto the permanent legal document, officially committing a massive federal felony right there on the glass coffee table. Natalie smiled an incredibly vicious, deeply triumphant smile as she proudly observed his absolute moral destruction. She enthusiastically reached into her expensive designer purse and swiftly retrieved a heavy, highly illegal device. She proudly produced a completely fake official notary stamp she had secretly purchased online from a highly shady international vendor several weeks ago. The counterfeit metal device perfectly replicated the strict governmental seal required to legally authorize massive residential property transfers. She aggressively positioned the heavy metal contraption directly over the freshly forged signature line at the very bottom of the crisp final page. She violently pressed the heavy seal down, locking her arms and throwing her entire body weight firmly against the hard glass table. The heavy mechanical stamp punched the fraudulent circular emblem deeply into the thick corporate paper, completely finalizing their deeply sinister, massively illegal financial scheme. The thick black ink dried instantly, permanently marking the binding legal paperwork with the absolute, undeniable stamp of their incredibly dark, completely unforgivable mutual criminal guilt tonight in this very room right here now. Natalie carefully lifted the fully forged, heavily stamped closing contract from the glass coffee table, handling the illegal paperwork with absolutely incredible reverence. She meticulously folded the crisp white pages and slid them perfectly into a brightly colored prepaid priority overnight shipping envelope. She aggressively sealed the thick cardboard flap shut firmly, running her manicured thumb directly across the sticky adhesive edge to guarantee absolute maximum security. Devon collapsed back against the soft velvet sofa, exhaling a massive, deeply shuddering breath of profound physical relief. They foolishly exchanged a highly triumphant, incredibly arrogant look of mutual victory, genuinely believing they had completely successfully executed the absolute perfect, entirely untraceable financial crime tonight. They honestly assumed they were completely safe, entirely convinced that their meticulously crafted web of deceitful lies would permanently secure their immensely luxurious future without any sudden disastrous consequences. They celebrated their dark criminal achievement, wholly oblivious to the terrifying reality, quietly observing their every single move from directly above. They never once bothered to look straight up at the incredibly high ceiling. They completely failed to notice the small, entirely unassuming plastic smoke detector mounted perfectly flush against the pristine white drywall directly above their heads. What they entirely failed to comprehend was that Dominic had secretly infiltrated the sprawling suburban estate weeks ago, expertly installing a completely undetectable, highly advanced digital surveillance lens directly inside that exact plastic housing unit. Dominic currently sat comfortably inside his dark downtown office, quietly sipping hot black coffee while aggressively monitoring his secure digital dashboard. He smiled a devastatingly cold, immensely powerful smile as he successfully captured their entire massively illegal forgery process in absolutely flawless, crystal clear 4K resolution, permanently securing the incredibly destructive, profoundly irrefutable video evidence required to instantly send both of them directly into federal prison. The anonymous corporate buyer responded to Devon's desperately forged contract with a sudden, highly rigid demand that completely shattered Natalie's temporary relief. The wealthy investment firm absolutely refused to transfer the massive multi-million-dollar cash settlement without conducting one final comprehensive interior appraisal of the sprawling suburban estate. They cited strict corporate protocol, completely rejecting Devon's frantic attempts to waive the mandatory physical inspection. Natalie recognized this unexpected demand as the absolute final hurdle standing between her crumbling reality and her desperately needed financial salvation. She immediately shifted into a state of intensely aggressive, highly manic preparation. She completely terrorized Devon, forcing him to scrub the gleaming hardwood floors while she systematically purged the massive house of any visible imperfections. She spent countless agonizing hours meticulously staging the expansive living room, arranging expensive imported floral bouquets and strategically positioning luxury decor to completely mask their underlying desperation. She violently demanded absolute pristine perfection, treating the upcoming visit as the most critical theatrical performance of her entire life. She aggressively fluffed the expensive velvet cushions and polished the vast granite kitchen island until the dark stone practically mirrored her deeply panicked expression. Natalie fully understood that a flawless appraisal report would instantly unlock the massive escrow account and permanently rescue her from total financial annihilation. She ruthlessly ordered Devon to hide his overwhelming anxiety, threatening to completely destroy him if his sweating face alerted the corporate inspector to their massive underlying fraud. She stood firmly in the grand foyer, smoothing her heavily branded designer dress, utterly convinced that her superficial staging would easily deceive whoever walked through those heavy mahogany doors. She prepared to aggressively charm the inspector, completely unaware that this mandatory visit was entirely orchestrated by the very same phantom forces actively plotting her inescapable doom permanently right now today. The heavy brass doorbell chimed sharply, signaling the terrifying arrival of the corporate inspector. Natalie swung the massive mahogany door open, radiating a sickeningly bright, intensely practiced smile intended to disarm the vital evaluator instantly. The official appraiser stepped firmly into the grand foyer, wearing a remarkably strict dark charcoal business suit and exceptionally thick dark-rimmed glasses that entirely obscured his sharp, calculating eyes. He did not return her overly enthusiastic greeting or offer a single polite introductory remark. He carried a highly sophisticated digital clipboard and a heavy metallic measuring laser, projecting an incredibly intimidating aura of absolute, uncompromising professional authority. He completely bypassed her outstretched hand, marching directly into the sprawling living space with chilling mechanical efficiency. He initiated his rigorous inspection immediately, thoroughly examining the structural integrity of the property without uttering a single spoken word to the desperately hovering couple. He tapped the walls meticulously, inspecting the pristine drywall for any deeply hidden structural inconsistencies or poorly executed amateur modifications. He systematically ran his high-powered laser along the baseboards, silently evaluating the fundamental stability of the massive concrete foundation holding the sprawling estate together. Natalie watched his incredibly rigid movements with mounting silent panic, realizing her superficial cosmetic staging meant absolutely nothing to this fiercely meticulous professional. The appraiser marched aggressively outside into the freezing winter air, directly analyzing the precise exterior property lines and measuring the specific physical boundaries of the large lot. Devon stood frozen near the kitchen, his pale face dripping with a thick layer of terrified sweat as he watched the silent man ruthlessly dissect the very property he had just illegally stolen. The incredibly quiet, fiercely methodical inspection aggressively amplified the suffocating tension, transforming the supposedly routine corporate visit into an agonizing, intensely terrifying psychological interrogation right here inside the house. Natalie aggressively shadowed the silent appraiser, shadowing his incredibly rigid movements from room to room with an increasingly desperate, highly frantic sales pitch. She loudly boasted about the immense, artificially inflated property value, aggressively pointing out her superficial cosmetic upgrades while completely ignoring his terrifyingly cold silence. She practically shouted about the imported Italian marble and the incredibly expensive luxury lighting fixtures, desperately attempting to distract him from his deeply methodical structural investigation. The strict appraiser completely ignored her incredibly frantic chatter, acting as if her extremely shrill voice simply did not exist within the physical space. He deliberately bypassed her heavily staged visual elements, focusing his high-powered metallic laser entirely on the highly problematic areas she desperately wanted completely hidden. He meticulously documented the exact locations where Natalie had recklessly demolished vital load-bearing structures to rapidly expand her massive, fully renovated luxury basement. He took incredibly specific, highly precise laser measurements of the profound structural damages she had directly caused during her superficial, entirely unpermitted home renovations. He systematically recorded the massive electrical violations resulting from her highly rushed, deeply amateur installation of expensive, luxury home theater components. His sleek digital clipboard practically glowed as he furiously logged every single catastrophic code violation and highly illegal architectural alteration she had so arrogantly executed without securing proper municipal permits. Natalie's highly practiced, confident smile completely shattered as she finally comprehended the terrifying exact nature of his highly focused, completely silent assessment. He was not merely appraising the immense visual beauty of the sprawling suburban estate. He was aggressively documenting a massive, highly illegal construction disaster, completely dismantling her incredibly fake narrative and severely threatening the entire multi-million-dollar transaction with his incredibly sharp, completely uncompromising professional precision right now inside this newly broken and fully corrupted physical environment right here today. The fiercely strict appraiser finalized his incredibly damaging physical assessment and swiftly closed his glowing digital clipboard with a remarkably sharp, highly authoritative snap. He walked aggressively toward the heavy mahogany front doors, completely refusing to offer Natalie a single comforting smile or any basic professional reassurance regarding the immensely lucrative transaction. He exited the sprawling estate in total silence, marching directly down the snowy driveway to slide inside an unmarked black sedan waiting quietly by the icy curb. Dominic sat comfortably in the driver's seat, completely hidden behind the heavily tinted vehicle windows. The silent inspector efficiently handed the highly encrypted digital device directly to the incredibly lethal private investigator. Dominic quickly opened the incredibly damning file, his cold eyes scanning the extensive, deeply catastrophic structural review. The comprehensive corporate report irrefutably proved that Natalie had recklessly conducted severely unpermitted structural changes, entirely destroying the fundamental safety of the entire suburban property. Her incredibly arrogant, incredibly rushed basement renovation severely violated countless strict municipal zoning laws, permanently invalidating the active certificate of occupancy. Dominic aggressively verified that her profoundly stupid architectural destruction immediately incurred massive, completely inescapable municipal fines, totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. The incredibly heavy local government penalties were now officially attached directly to the physical property deed that Devon had just fraudulently transferred entirely into his own desperate name. My incredibly greedy son had illegally stolen a highly toxic, severely compromised asset, currently bleeding massive amounts of immediate cash. Devon firmly believed he was brilliantly escaping his crushing, immense personal debt today. Instead, he had successfully forged his own signature onto a violently sinking, highly illegal financial anchor, completely trapping himself in an inescapable, extremely brutal, and totally permanent legal nightmare right now, tonight, absolutely guaranteeing his immediate and entirely total destruction forever right now. I sat comfortably inside my quiet hotel suite, methodically reviewing the comprehensive financial dossier Dominic had meticulously compiled over the past several months. The incredibly thick, heavily secured binder contained irrefutable, deeply damaging proof of Devon's massive corporate embezzlement scheme. My son had arrogantly manipulated complex logistics ledgers, deliberately diverting hundreds of thousands of corporate dollars directly into his own private offshore accounts to secretly fund Natalie's insatiable suburban lifestyle. He genuinely believed his sophisticated digital shell game was entirely undetectable. I felt absolutely no paternal hesitation as I carefully separated the highly toxic financial evidence into 5 distinct heavy manila envelopes. I specifically addressed these thick, damning packages directly to the chief executive officer and the 4 senior board members commanding Devon's prestigious logistics firm. I firmly pressed the adhesive seals closed, locking his absolute professional destruction inside the plain brown paper. I did not include a single explanatory note or any personal vindictive message. The raw, unfiltered financial data spoke with terrifying clarity, requiring absolutely zero additional context to immediately trigger a massive federal corporate investigation. I calmly walked down to the bustling hotel lobby and handed the heavy envelopes directly to a waiting private courier. I watched the uniformed messenger walk briskly through the revolving glass doors, carrying the absolute end of Devon's incredibly lucrative corporate career straight into the busy city traffic. My deeply arrogant son had spent the entire morning falsely believing he had successfully forged his magnificent escape from crippling personal debt. He was completely unaware that the very foundation of his entire fraudulent existence was currently traveling rapidly toward his executive boardroom. I simply returned to my quiet room, poured myself a warm cup of black coffee, and patiently waited for the inevitable, highly destructive corporate explosion to finally detonate across town today. Devon sat incredibly comfortably behind his massive mahogany desk, staring blindly at the glowing computer monitor while actively daydreaming about his massive impending windfall. He aggressively calculated the exact multi-million-dollar real estate settlement slowly transferring into his private bank account later this evening. He felt a profound, deeply intoxicating rush of absolute relief wash entirely over his severely stressed body. He genuinely believed that his highly stressful, incredibly illegal forgery had successfully neutralized Natalie's devastating credit card debts and permanently secured his prestigious executive lifestyle without generating any visible consequences whatsoever. He casually leaned back against his expensive leather chair, clasping his sweaty hands securely behind his head, thoroughly enjoying the fleeting, highly artificial sensation of total, absolute victory. He completely ignored the mounting stack of critical logistics reports demanding his immediate personal attention today. His arrogant corporate daydream abruptly shattered into a million tiny fragments when his heavy frosted glass office door swung violently open without a single polite warning knock. The severe director of human resources marched aggressively into his private sanctuary, projecting an incredibly intimidating aura of absolute uncompromising professional authority. She was immediately followed by two highly serious, completely unsmiling corporate forensic auditors wearing remarkably strict charcoal business suits. They swiftly bypassed his shocked assistant, stepping firmly onto the plush carpet and instantly locking the heavy glass door securely behind them. The profoundly tense, incredibly suffocating silence rapidly expanded across the spacious corner office, immediately plunging Devon into a state of absolute sheer, terrifying panic. He aggressively dropped his hands from his sweating head, violently sitting upright while frantically searching their cold, remarkably unforgiving faces for any logical explanation. The massive corporate trap had finally violently snapped shut, securely catching my incredibly arrogant son entirely off guard right here inside this building this morning. The severe human resources director stepped aggressively forward, slapping a massive, heavily indexed binder violently onto the absolute center of Devon's pristine mahogany desk. The incredibly loud, sharp impact completely shattered his remaining fragile composure. She did not offer a single comfortable pleasantry or any preliminary professional courtesy. She stared directly into his wildly darting, terrified eyes and coldly declared that the logistics company had officially uncovered absolutely massive financial irregularities directly originating from his highly secure executive terminal. One of the strictly dressed auditors stepped silently forward, aggressively, opening the thick binder to completely expose pages of highly detailed, undeniably irrefutable digital transaction logs. The impeccably organized corporate evidence flawlessly highlighted every single altered vendor invoice and clearly traced the massively diverted company funds completely back to his secretly maintained offshore banking accounts. Devon frantically attempted to aggressively deny the catastrophic allegations, stammering wildly about incredibly complex accounting errors and massive system data glitches. The second auditor completely ignored his incredibly pathetic lies, ruthlessly unplugging Devon's expensive company laptop directly from the office wall socket. He aggressively confiscated the highly secure digital device, physically securing the vital hardware into a tamper-proof evidence bag right in front of Devon's heavily sweating face. The human resources director firmly demanded his official corporate security badge, violently instructing him to immediately surrender all physical company property without any further unnecessary administrative delay. She aggressively informed him that his extremely lucrative employment was completely terminated, effectively immediately permanently severing his incredibly prestigious executive salary. Devon's sweaty hands visibly trembled as he slowly unclipped the plastic identification badge directly from his custom-tailored silk tie, fully realizing that his entire professional reputation, his massive corporate income, and his absolutely vital financial stability had been entirely obliterated in less than 5 incredibly terrifying minutes today. 2 heavily armed corporate security guards forcefully escorted the completely ruined executive directly out of the towering glass skyscraper, aggressively marching him past dozens of shocked, silently staring former colleagues. Devon stumbled violently onto the freezing concrete sidewalk, utterly humiliated and completely stripped of his entire powerful corporate identity. He frantically retrieved his personal smartphone with violently shaking fingers, hyperventilating as the terrifying reality of his massive, completely inescapable federal crimes finally crushed his severely panicked chest. He desperately dialed Natalie's private number, urgently needing to completely halt the highly fraudulent real estate transaction before she officially finalized the permanently catastrophic sale. He practically screamed into the digital receiver, wildly praying that his incredibly arrogant wife would immediately answer the mobile phone and instantly abort their immensely toxic criminal scheme right now today. However, straight across the busy city, Natalie actively ignored his increasingly desperate, incredibly frantic digital ringtone vibrating relentlessly inside her expensive designer purse. She completely dismissed his frantic incoming emergency call arrogantly, assuming Devon was merely experiencing another pathetic wave of severe emotional anxiety regarding his flawlessly executed forgery. She stood proudly outside the prestigious Metropolitan Title Office, entirely consumed by her own massive, incredibly destructive greed. She confidently adjusted her deeply expensive designer cashmere coat and smiled an incredibly vicious, remarkably triumphant smile. entirely convinced that her magnificent financial salvation was waiting silently behind those heavy front glass doors. She aggressively stepped directly inside the bustling legal lobby, blissfully unaware that her completely oblivious husband had just permanently lost his entire massive corporate income forever. She eagerly marched straight toward the main reception desk, loudly preparing to officially close the massive fraudulent deal and violently trigger the absolute totally catastrophic destruction of her entire privileged suburban life, permanently and completely without any further administrative delay tonight. Natalie strode through the towering revolving glass doors of the prestigious downtown financial district building with the aggressive swagger of an absolute conqueror. She wore a pristine, tailored ivory trench coat over a completely unblemished designer dress, audibly projecting her intensely arrogant confidence with every single sharp click of her expensive stilettos against the polished marble floor. She completely ignored the standard security protocols, marching directly toward the executive elevator bank to ascend to the highly exclusive penthouse suite of the premier title agency. Her mind was entirely consumed by incredibly vivid, aggressively greedy fantasies of immense, unchecked wealth. She practically tasted the massive corporate cash settlement that would instantly erase her suffocating hidden debts and permanently fund her incredibly luxurious, entirely fraudulent suburban lifestyle. She aggressively burst into the sleek reception area, instantly demanding immediate assistance from the visibly startled administrative staff. She loudly ordered the senior closing agent to completely bypass the standard introductory formalities and drastically expedite the final legal paperwork without a single second of unnecessary delay. She aggressively drummed her manicured fingers against the polished granite reception desk, radiating an incredibly toxic, overwhelmingly demanding aura of absolute impatience. She sharply reminded the nervous clerk that she possessed a strictly binding contract requiring immediate finalization before midnight, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic reality rapidly converging upon her isolated position. She genuinely believed her desperate husband had successfully executed the absolute perfect forgery, completely unaware that Devon was currently standing on a freezing sidewalk, utterly stripped of his entire corporate career. Natalie stood proudly under the bright recessed lighting, fiercely clutching her expensive leather handbag, perfectly ready to officially claim her stolen millions and permanently lock away my entire legacy behind a massive wall of incredibly dark, totally inescapable deceit, right here, exactly at this very moment. The deeply intimidated closing agent nervously nodded frantically, gathering a thick stack of blank legal folders before hastily guiding Natalie straight down the impeccably illuminated luxury corridor. He respectfully ushered her directly into a massive, entirely transparent glass conference room securely positioned at the exact far end of the sprawling executive floor. The breathtaking architectural space featured a tremendously long, solid mahogany meeting table, completely surrounded by incredibly plush, dark leather executive chairs. Massive panoramic windows provided a completely unobstructed, heavily dominant vertical view of the sprawling metropolitan skyline, glowing brilliantly under the fading afternoon sun. The young agent politely informed her that the primary corporate buyer would be arriving momentarily to personally finalize the massive cash transfer, leaving her completely alone inside the silent, heavily soundproofed environment. Natalie aggressively tossed her expensive designer handbag directly onto the smooth mahogany surface, confidently claiming the absolute primary seat positioned perfectly at the very head of the imposing table. She completely absorbed the profound, deeply intoxicating silence of the massive room, entirely viewing this highly isolated moment as her absolute, undisputed coronation. She arrogantly crossed her legs, staring fiercely at the distant city skyline, wildly imagining the incredibly lavish, totally uninhibited international vacations she would immediately purchase, using my entirely stolen personal wealth. The heavy, profoundly thick oak door securely positioned directly behind her expensive chair suddenly unlocked with a sharp, incredibly loud mechanical click. The polished brass handle slowly rotated downward, pushing the massive wooden frame steadily inward with a remarkably smooth, deeply terrifying metallic groan. Natalie eagerly spun her heavy leather chair entirely around, flashing a brilliantly white, highly practiced corporate smile, completely expecting to finally greet the incredibly wealthy anonymous corporate billionaire preparing to permanently hand her absolute financial salvation right now inside this very quiet room here today. I stepped confidently through the heavy oak door, instantly filling the massive glass conference room with my undeniable, heavily grounded physical presence. I wore an impeccably tailored navy suit projecting an aura of absolutely unquestionable authority that entirely dominated the sterile corporate environment. Gregory strode perfectly synchronized at my immediate right, clutching a thick, completely lethal leather briefcase containing the absolute totality of their impending legal doom. Dominic mirrored him flawlessly at my immediate left, crossing his incredibly muscular arms while silently sealing the only exit firmly behind us. The brilliantly fake, heavily practiced smile plastered across Natalie's heavily powdered face completely shattered into a million tiny, imperceptible pieces the exact millisecond her arrogant eyes finally registered my imposing silhouette. Her manicured fingers violently gripped the smooth mahogany table, her knuckles instantly turning bone white under the crushing pressure of her sudden, wildly uncontrollable panic. She sat absolutely paralyzed within the oversized leather chair, staring at the three of us with profoundly bulging, incredibly terrified eyes. The deafening, practically suffocating silence stretched agonizingly across the massive room, ruthlessly amplifying her entirely inescapable reality. Natalie abruptly stood up, her expensive stilettos scraping loudly against the pristine floor, desperately attempting to regain a single shred of her completely shattered false confidence. She aggressively pointed a shaking, highly manicured finger directly toward my face, her voice violently vibrating with sheer, unadulterated hysteria. She shrilly demanded to explicitly know exactly what her pathetic, completely senile old father-in-law was currently doing, illegally trespassing inside her highly secure, entirely private corporate closing meeting today. She fiercely yelled for the absent closing agent, completely failing to truly understand that I was actually the exact anonymous corporate titan she had been eagerly waiting to gladly surrender her completely stolen property unto right here, right now today. I did not raise my steady voice or respond to her increasingly frantic, highly aggressive screaming. I calmly approached the solid mahogany table, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact with my deeply terrified daughter-in-law. I reached deliberately into my tailored jacket pocket and slowly extracted the pristine priority overnight shipping envelope containing the exact documents Devon had illegally signed last night. I smoothly unsealed the thick cardboard flap, pulling out the heavily stamped, flawlessly forged purchase contract. I placed the fraudulent legal paperwork directly onto the cold glass surface, slowly sliding it completely across the expansive table until it rested perfectly beneath her violently trembling hands. Her incredibly sharp eyes darted wildly toward the bottom page, instantly recognizing the fake notary seal and the desperate, highly illegal cursive signature of her husband. I leaned slightly forward, resting my large palms firmly against the smooth wood, projecting absolute inescapable dominance over her entirely shattered world. I calmly informed her in a remarkably cold, deeply resonant voice that the massive anonymous investment firm she had been eagerly, aggressively negotiating with was actually my completely private, entirely personal financial trust fund. I explicitly revealed that she had just legally surrendered her entire stolen real estate empire directly back into my absolute ownership. The sheer, completely unadulterated horror rippling violently across the pale face of Natalie was absolutely glorious to silently witness today. She literally gasped, stumbling backward against the expensive leather chair, completely realizing that her incredibly arrogant greed had permanently trapped them both inside an inescapable, highly destructive federal nightmare. Before her completely paralyzed brain could even begin processing this massive corporate checkmate, Gregory stepped fiercely forward. He loudly unlatched his briefcase and aggressively slid a remarkably thick, heavy stack of impending federal fraud indictments directly next to the forged contract. Natalie stared blindly at the towering stack of federal fraud indictments resting heavily upon the polished mahogany table. The absolute certainty of her impending destruction finally pierced her suffocating arrogance. She frantically stumbled backward, her expensive stiletto heels scraping harshly against the pristine hardwood floor as she desperately sought physical distance from the damning legal documents. Her heavily powdered face contorted into a pathetic mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. She violently shook her head wildly, attempting to verbally dismantle the inescapable reality closing in around her throat. She stammered uncontrollably loudly, insisting that an outrageous misunderstanding had occurred within this isolated conference room. Her shrill voice vibrated with intensely toxic desperation as she aggressively pivoted her entire defense strategy to utterly destroy her own husband. She fiercely denied possessing any fundamental knowledge regarding the forged real estate contract sitting directly in front of my steady hands. She viciously threw Devon entirely under the proverbial bus without a single shred of matrimonial hesitation or basic human loyalty. She aggressively pointed her shaking manicured finger toward the fraudulent paperwork, loudly claiming that Devon had personally orchestrated the entire illegal transaction entirely behind her back. She practically screamed that he had exclusively handled every single piece of closing documentation, completely isolating her from his deeply criminal corporate enterprise. She painted herself as a tragically naive, completely innocent suburban housewife who simply trusted her deeply flawed partner. She brazenly lied directly to my face, vehemently asserting that she possessed absolutely zero involvement in executing the massive financial forgery currently threatening her luxurious freedom. She desperately begged me to believe her incredibly pathetic, highly fabricated narrative, fully expecting her practiced superficial charm to magically erase her undeniable complicity in this immensely destructive, deeply unforgivable, completely undeniable criminal plot happening right here inside this room today. Dominic calmly stepped forward, completely ignoring Natalie's remarkably shrill, intensely frantic verbal denials. He smoothly placed his sleek titanium laptop directly onto the polished mahogany conference table, positioning the brilliant high-resolution screen perfectly facing her trembling figure. He deliberately pressed a single computer key, instantly executing the incredibly lethal digital file he had so expertly recorded. The brilliant 4K video footage immediately illuminated the heavily darkened boardroom, vividly projecting the undeniable visual truth of her profound federal guilt. The incredibly sharp, perfectly focused recording explicitly showcased Devon desperately practicing my cursive signature onto the yellow legal pad, while Natalie hovered aggressively over his sweating shoulder. The hidden camera flawlessly captured her violently demanding absolute perfection, ruthlessly commanding her deeply terrified husband to complete the massive financial felony. The pristine digital footage transitioned seamlessly, completely exposing Natalie proudly retrieving the illegal counterfeit notary stamp directly from her expensive designer purse. The remarkably crisp audio perfectly captured the extremely heavy, violent mechanical thud as she aggressively slammed the fake governmental seal straight down onto the forged closing contract. Her own distinctly sharp, incredibly arrogant voice echoed loudly throughout the highly soundproofed corporate space, explicitly mocking my supposed ignorance while she enthusiastically celebrated their entirely mutual criminal victory. She was undeniably captured on pure, unadulterated high-definition video, actively finalizing the incredibly destructive federal forgery. The incredibly clear, undeniably damning digital playback systematically demolished every single pathetic lie she had just frantically vomited across the glass table. Dominic slowly closed the titanium laptop, allowing the incredibly heavy, entirely suffocating silence to immediately crash back down over the massive room. He offered her an incredibly cold, utterly merciless smile, permanently confirming that her meticulously fabricated facade of innocent suburban victimhood was now completely, utterly, and absolutely annihilated forever today, right here, right now. An incredibly heavy, absolutely profound silence violently suffocated the massive glass conference room as the catastrophic reality of her inescapable doom entirely crushed her soul. The vibrant, highly practiced color drained completely from Natalie's sharply contoured face, leaving her terribly pale and physically trembling under the blinding fluorescent lights. The terrifying, incredibly vivid realization that she was actively facing several decades locked inside a bleak federal prison completely shattered her remaining arrogant demeanor. Her deeply superficial confidence instantly evaporated entirely, replaced by an incredibly profound, overwhelmingly raw wave of pure, unadulterated panic. She slowly collapsed forward against the polished mahogany table, her expensive designer dress severely wrinkling as her manicured hands aggressively clutched her own throbbing head. The incredibly toxic, immensely arrogant woman who had mercilessly orchestrated my severe psychological destruction was now completely reduced to a violently shivering, incredibly pathetic shell of absolute desperation. She frantically lifted her tear-stained face, staring directly into my cold, entirely uncompromising eyes with incredibly pathetic, wildly desperate pleading. She vehemently begged me for complete, immediate mercy, wildly promising to instantly return every single stolen dollar and permanently abandon all fraudulent claims against my massive suburban estate. She hysterically swore to aggressively sign any binding legal document Gregory demanded, desperately offering to entirely surrender her remaining pathetic assets if I simply destroyed the incredibly damning video evidence and officially canceled the massive federal fraud indictments. She cried incredibly loud, wildly pathetic tears, drastically attempting to emotionally manipulate my completely frozen heart with incredibly fake, highly desperate remorse. She ruthlessly blamed her incredibly suffocating hidden debts and her intensely toxic greed, practically screaming that she simply could not survive inside a violent federal penitentiary. Her incredibly frantic, completely humiliating begging echoed violently against the cold glass walls, permanently, completely right here today, right now. I did not blink a single time as I stared completely mercilessly downward into her intensely desperate, heavily streaming eyes. I felt absolutely zero paternal compassion or basic human sympathy for the highly toxic woman who had so eagerly attempted to permanently destroy my entire life. I remained entirely perfectly motionless, allowing her incredibly pathetic sobbing to echo wildly across the massive, utterly silent corporate conference room without offering a single word of undeserved comfort. I smoothly signaled Gregory with a remarkably subtle, highly calculated wave of my steady right hand. My fiercely loyal attorney immediately stepped aggressively forward, entirely ignoring her incredibly loud, wildly hysterical pleas for unearned corporate clemency. Gregory swiftly extracted a single crisp white legal document directly from his heavy leather briefcase and slammed it forcefully onto the polished mahogany table right next to the massive federal indictments. I calmly informed my entirely ruined daughter-in-law that the freshly printed paperwork was a strict, legally binding formal 3-day notice to permanently quit the suburban premises. I loudly declared that she had exactly 72 hours to rapidly pack her deeply expensive designer garbage and completely evacuate my privately owned property before armed sheriffs aggressively dragged her violently out onto the freezing street. Natalie stared at the harsh eviction notice, her incredibly arrogant brain completely failing to process the absolutely devastating, highly catastrophic totality of her immediate financial doom. I leaned aggressively forward, smiling an incredibly dark, utterly unforgiving smile that completely shattered her remaining sanity. I calmly informed her that a massive tactical squad of heavily armed local police officers was currently waiting patiently outside the suburban house for Devon to arrive. I deliberately turned my broad back against her frantic screaming, proudly leaving her to permanently face her absolute total destruction entirely alone right here today now. Natalie spun around violently and sprinted out of the sprawling executive conference room, completely abandoning any remaining shred of her heavily manufactured corporate dignity. Her expensive designer stilettos clicked frantically against the polished marble floors as she practically shoved her way past the bewildered administrative staff in the sleek reception area. She smashed her trembling hand against the elevator button, her heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. The sudden, absolutely catastrophic revelation of my immense hidden wealth and the crushing reality of impending federal fraud indictments completely destroyed her inherently greedy mind. She bolted through the massive revolving glass doors and sprinted toward her luxury vehicle parked illegally along the icy downtown curb. She threw herself into the driver's seat, slamming the heavy door shut before stomping aggressively on the accelerator. The powerful engine roared as she drove recklessly through the crowded city streets, viciously swerving between slower vehicles and aggressively running multiple red traffic lights. Her incredibly toxic survival instincts completely overrode any basic maternal or marital loyalty she ever pretended to possess. She rapidly formulated a highly selfish, utterly cowardly escape plan while speeding aggressively down the freezing suburban highway. She intended to completely bypass her devastated husband, aggressively pack her most valuable designer handbags with whatever expensive jewelry she could swiftly carry, and entirely abandon her completely ruined marriage before the heavily armed local authorities officially descended upon the stolen property. She wildly calculated her immediate flight trajectory brutally, deciding to leave Devon entirely alone to face the catastrophic federal consequences of the massive financial forgery they had mutually committed just hours ago. She gripped the leather steering wheel with absolutely terrifying intensity, completely driven by pure, unadulterated panic. and an overwhelmingly desperate, incredibly selfish desire to survive independently right here, right now, today. Natalie violently slammed her luxury vehicle directly into the snowy suburban driveway, completely ignoring the massive icy snowdrifts violently scraping against the expensive custom paint. She aggressively sprinted directly toward the heavy mahogany front doors, wildly turning her polished brass key with intensely shaking fingers. She aggressively burst entirely through the grand entrance violently, throwing her incredibly expensive designer coat directly onto the pristine marble floor. She immediately discovered Devon sitting completely paralyzed across the expensive imported living room carpet. His intensely sweating, heavily trembling hands tightly gripped the official corporate termination papers he had just received earlier today. He stared entirely blindly toward the massive fireplace, looking absolutely, utterly destroyed by the devastating, catastrophic reality currently crushing his entire pathetic existence. Natalie aggressively stormed straight toward his defeated figure. Practically vibrating with pure, unadulterated marital rage, she completely ignored his obvious psychological devastation, loudly screaming directly into his incredibly pale face with absolute maximum hostility. She fiercely blamed his sheer, pathetic incompetence for permanently destroying her beautifully crafted suburban life, violently criticizing his massive failure to successfully hide his incredibly obvious corporate embezzlement from the strict logistics auditors. She wildly waved her aggressively manicured hands, loudly shouting that his profoundly stupid financial miscalculations had permanently destroyed their only desperate chance at ultimate survival. She viciously mocked his absolute failure to properly finalize the heavily forged real estate transaction, violently declaring that his profound corporate stupidity had completely handed my legal team the exact irrefutable evidence required to systematically bury them both. She fiercely berated his pathetic weakness, aggressively stating that his total, absolute inability to successfully manage his own private corporate accounts had completely doomed her beautifully luxurious future permanently, without any further administrative delay tonight, right here, right now, inside this very exact isolated room today, entirely, forever. Devon finally snapped completely under her incredibly toxic barrage of violent verbal abuse. He aggressively threw the crumpled corporate termination papers directly into her furious face, abruptly standing up with sheer, unadulterated venom radiating from his bloodshot eyes. He viciously screamed back at his completely arrogant wife, violently revealing the incredibly terrifying absolute truth regarding my actual immense hidden wealth. He fiercely informed her that the completely pathetic, supposedly senile old man she had ruthlessly mocked was actually a profoundly powerful, totally undisputed corporate titan who possessed massive international assets, far exceeding any suburban fantasy she ever dared imagine. He aggressively pointed his trembling finger directly at her chest, loudly accusing her incredibly toxic, utterly insatiable greed of violently pushing him entirely into massive, crippling debt and highly destructive federal crimes. He fiercely blamed her relentless demands for completely unnecessary luxury renovations and deeply expensive designer clothing for directly forcing his incredibly desperate corporate embezzlement scheme in the absolute first place. He loudly declared that her deeply superficial, entirely materialistic obsession had completely destroyed his once pristine professional logistics career and permanently guaranteed his impending federal prison sentence tonight. He viciously laughed, a terribly hollow, wildly manic laugh, aggressively informing her that her absolute sheer arrogance had permanently blinded her from successfully recognizing the massive legal trap securely closing directly around their utterly pathetic necks. The deeply fractured marriage completely imploded right there inside the sprawling luxury living room, instantly disintegrating into pure violent hatred and absolute mutual resentment. They stood fiercely glaring at one another, completely stripped of their incredibly fake suburban perfection, fully realizing they had permanently destroyed their entire lives entirely for absolutely nothing, tangible or truly meaningful, right here today, forever and entirely permanently, inside this very cold, isolated, empty room, right here, right now, tonight. Natalie completely dismissed his incredibly pathetic verbal breakdown, ruthlessly turning her rigid back directly toward his sobbing, utterly defeated figure, sitting pathetically on the floor. She viciously dragged her massive, heavily stuffed designer suitcase aggressively across the pristine, imported hardwood flooring, leaving deep, highly visible scratch marks permanently trailing directly behind her frantic escape path. She wildly adjusted her expensive cashmere winter coat, desperately refusing to fully accept the terrifying apocalyptic reality actively collapsing entirely around her incredibly arrogant head. She fully intended to completely abandon her completely shattered marriage, fiercely plotting to entirely vanish into the dark, freezing suburban night permanently without a single ounce of matrimonial hesitation or basic human remorse whatsoever today. She practically sprinted toward the towering mahogany front entryway, aggressively reaching her trembling manicured hand straight toward the shiny, polished brass handle to physically secure her ultimate cowardly departure. 3 incredibly sharp, absolutely deafening, terribly heavy mechanical knocks violently echoed directly through the thick wooden frame, completely shattering the tense, isolated silence perfectly encompassing the massive ruined estate. Natalie froze entirely, perfectly still, her incredibly toxic heart practically stopping completely inside her tightly constricted, utterly panicked chest right now, at this exact terrified second. The heavy mahogany door violently swung entirely open before her shaking fingers could even manage to properly turn the interior locking mechanism. 2 incredibly stern, fully uniformed, heavily armed local police officers immediately stepped aggressively directly inside the expansive grand foyer, strictly blocking her entire designated escape route permanently. They completely ignored her incredibly shocked, deeply pale expression, actively projecting an absolutely uncompromising, intensely terrifying aura of sheer legal authority. They stepped aggressively forward, firmly holding massive official federal arrest warrants guaranteeing their immediate, permanent, absolute, total corporate incarceration permanently tonight, right here, today, right now, absolutely forever and entirely permanently. The 2 heavily armed local police officers stepped firmly into the grand foyer, their heavy black boots thudding ominously against the pristine marble flooring. They completely ignored the shattered remnants of Natalie's designer luggage scattered across the entrance. The lead officer, a tall man with an incredibly stern expression, immediately locked his unyielding gaze onto Devon's thoroughly defeated figure still sitting pathetically on the ground. He formally announced that they possessed a federal warrant for his immediate arrest regarding massive corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny. The officer aggressively commanded Devon to stand up, explicitly reading him his Miranda rights in a remarkably cold, entirely mechanical tone that echoed violently through the tense suburban house. Devon slowly complied, his legs physically trembling under the devastating weight of his absolute financial ruin, while the officer meticulously outlined his right to remain silent and his right to an attorney. Simultaneously, the second officer aggressively turned his strict attention directly toward Natalie. She remained completely frozen near the heavy mahogany door, utterly paralyzed by the sudden catastrophic reality violently crashing down upon her arrogant head. The second officer sternly informed her that she was also being formally placed under immediate federal arrest. He ruthlessly listed her specific catastrophic charges, explicitly citing massive real estate fraud, deliberate criminal forgery, and active conspiracy to commit grand theft. He began loudly reading her the exact same Miranda rights, completely dismantling her desperate illusion of suburban invincibility. She suddenly gasped very loudly, her manicured hands violently shaking as the absolute totality of her impending incarceration finally crushed her heavily powdered face. The officers acted with absolute, uncompromising professional efficiency, deliberately stripping away every single layer of their privileged, highly fabricated domestic existence, entirely right here inside this ruined home today, without showing any further administrative hesitation. Natalie violently rejected the terrifying reality of her sudden arrest, aggressively shifting into an absolutely ruthless state of pure, unadulterated, selfish survival mindset. She aggressively pointed her violently shaking manicured finger directly at Devon's completely defeated figure standing silently beside her. She loudly proclaimed to the 2 remarkably strict local police officers that she was merely a deeply terrified, utterly helpless hostage entirely trapped within his incredibly massive illegal criminal enterprise. She practically screamed that her highly incompetent husband had aggressively forced her to actively participate in his extremely toxic corporate schemes under severe psychological duress. She fiercely denied ever possessing any fundamental working knowledge regarding the heavily forged real estate contracts or the massive digital embezzlement explicitly draining his prestigious logistics company. She viciously threw the man she had proudly married entirely into the highly destructive federal crosshairs, desperately hoping her incredibly pathetic theatrical performance would magically completely absolve her of all undeniable federal guilt today. Devon simply stared directly at his wildly hysterical wife with an expression of absolute, entirely uncompromising disgust permanently etched across his pale face. The incredibly profound betrayal violently severed the final fragile threads holding their completely toxic marriage together right here in the grand foyer. He watched her aggressively lie to the armed authorities, utterly sickened by her incredibly transparent, thoroughly desperate attempt to escape the severe federal consequences she had personally orchestrated. He did not bother raising his quiet voice to fiercely contradict her incredibly shrill, highly fabricated narrative, fully understanding that the irrefutable digital video evidence sitting inside my secure briefcase had already permanently condemned them both. Her incredibly selfish, wildly pathetic accusations merely amplified the immense suffocating reality that their beautifully staged suburban existence had permanently imploded into a highly destructive, deeply inescapable criminal nightmare forever right here now today. The strict police officers completely ignored the highly toxic domestic implosion, ruthlessly securing heavy steel handcuffs tightly around both of their violently shaking wrists. The cold, utterly unforgiving metallic ratchets clicked sharply against the profound silence of the ruined foyer, permanently physically locking Natalie and Devon into their entirely inescapable federal nightmare. The armed authorities aggressively marched the completely shattered couple directly through the towering mahogany doors, physically forcing them violently out onto the perfectly manicured front lawn. The incredibly bright, completely merciless afternoon sun illuminated their absolute, utter humiliation for the entire prestigious suburban neighborhood to visibly witness today. Natalie desperately attempted to hide her heavily powdered, entirely tear-stained face behind her disheveled blonde hair, thoroughly crippled by the immense, absolutely suffocating reality of her highly publicized public destruction. The exact same wealthy suburban neighbors whom she had previously desperately attempted to aggressively manipulate and repeatedly deceive were now actively gathered securely along the freezing, icy sidewalks. They stood completely silently, eagerly watching the incredibly disgraceful, profoundly humiliating scene violently unfold right across the sprawling manicured grass. They stared directly at the completely ruined couple with absolute, undeniably sheer, unadulterated disgust, permanently stripping away any remaining pathetic shred of Natalie's highly fabricated, intensely arrogant social dominance. The incredibly heavy steel chains bound her trembling hands firmly behind her expensive designer dress, violently contrasting against the extremely wealthy, deeply superficial environment she had illegally stolen. Devon stumbled pathetically across the freezing concrete driveway, his severely pale, completely sweating face practically touching his incredibly expensive silk business tie. They were systematically marched straight toward the waiting black police cruisers, entirely permanently humiliated, directly beneath the highly judgmental, completely unforgiving eyes of the very specific suburban community they had illegally defrauded right here, absolutely forever right now today, this exact afternoon. Before the incredibly strict police officers could physically force the completely shattered couple directly into the securely caged rear seats of the waiting federal cruisers. A massive industrial tow truck violently, aggressively rumbled directly into the sprawling suburban driveway. The incredibly loud, highly obnoxious diesel engine roared terribly loudly, aggressively shattering whatever pathetic remaining fragments of absolute silence lingered across the freezing neighborhood. The heavy commercial vehicle aggressively reversed straight toward the incredibly expensive, fully customized luxury SUV Natalie had so arrogantly abandoned just minutes previously. Intense, violently flashing yellow strobe lights violently bathed the entire pristine driveway in an incredibly harsh, entirely unforgiving mechanical glare, perfectly highlighting her absolutely complete, total, catastrophic financial destruction. The highly rugged, entirely unsmiling repossession agent stepped aggressively down from the massive truck cabin carrying a highly secure digital tablet clearly displaying the incredibly damning corporate banking repossession orders. Natalie violently screamed against the incredibly cold steel handcuffs physically binding her wildly shaking wrists, frantically attempting to loudly demand absolutely an immediate halt to the incredibly public, highly deeply degrading mechanical confiscation permanently happening today. The completely unsympathetic agent completely ignored her, intensely pathetic, wildly hysterical suburban shrieking, smoothly attaching the heavy steel winch cable directly onto the front luxury axle of the immensely expensive designer vehicle. He aggressively secured the massive metallic hooks without showing a single ounce of basic human hesitation, explicitly informing the surrounding armed officers that the highly aggressive National Bank had officially strictly ordered the completely immediate repossession of the entirely unpaid, severely delinquent luxury asset. She completely helplessly watched her incredibly meticulously curated suburban image totally, entirely, completely disintegrate. She sobbed violently, uncontrollably, utterly, permanently broken as the heavy hydraulic machinery aggressively ripped her absolute final pathetic status symbol permanently, entirely away, right here today, exactly right now. The heavy steel doors slammed shut with a deafening metallic crash, physically separating the deeply arrogant couple into entirely distinct, incredibly bleak concrete holding cells deep inside the county jail. Natalie sat completely frozen on the rigid metal bench, her pristine ivory designer trench coat offering absolutely zero comfort against the freezing, deeply unforgiving institutional environment. The profoundly sterile fluorescent lighting aggressively illuminated the absolute catastrophic ruin of her beautifully curated suburban existence, ruthlessly stripping away every single layer of her entirely fabricated social superiority. She desperately hugged her knees tightly against her violently trembling chest, staring completely blindly at the heavily stained cinderblock wall directly across her tiny cell. Her intensely manicured fingers practically dug straight through the expensive cashmere fabric, desperately trying to physically anchor her entirely shattered mind against the massive, suffocating reality of her impending federal incarceration. Straight across the incredibly bleak detention corridor, Devon paced frantically inside his own highly restricted concrete cage, his heavily sweating face practically mirroring the exact terrified expression of his completely isolated wife. His custom-tailored silk suit hung pathetically from his severely defeated frame, looking absolutely absurd against the deeply hostile, incredibly grim penal background. He aggressively rubbed his shaking hands directly across his violently throbbing temples, entirely unable to escape the crushing psychological weight of his absolutely monumental corporate failure. He fully recognized that his incredibly toxic, immensely greedy decisions had permanently obliterated his extremely prestigious logistics career and completely destroyed his entire future forever today. The deeply suffocating silence of the county lockup aggressively amplified his overwhelming panic, ruthlessly forcing him to finally confront the absolute sheer magnitude of his highly destructive federal crimes without any further luxurious suburban distractions right here inside this perfectly cold, entirely unforgiving penal environment right now, this very exact dark afternoon. A stern corrections officer aggressively approached Devon's concrete cell, firmly unlocking the heavily secured metal gate to formally offer the completely ruined executive his single, legally mandated telephone call. Devon practically sprinted toward the bleak institutional wall phone, his intensely sweating fingers violently trembling as he desperately punched in the deeply familiar digital digits. He wildly prayed that his incredibly powerful father would immediately answer the emergency line and completely rescue him from this absolutely terrifying, immensely degrading federal catastrophe today. Miles across the bustling metropolitan district, I sat perfectly comfortably inside my beautifully appointed luxury penthouse suite, quietly sipping a remarkably smooth glass of expensive imported bourbon. I stared completely peacefully through the massive panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows, thoroughly enjoying the spectacularly breathtaking view of the glowing city skyline radiating brilliantly under the clear evening sky. The sleek digital phone resting smoothly upon my polished mahogany desk suddenly vibrated with a sharp, highly demanding ringtone, directly indicating an incoming call directly from the Regional County Detention Center. I calmly placed my crystal glass straight down onto the pristine surface, feeling absolutely zero paternal anxiety or basic human hesitation regarding my completely arrogant son's totally inevitable public downfall. I deliberately allowed the electronic device to ring 3 exact times, explicitly controlling the immense psychological pacing of this highly critical, permanently defining interaction before smoothly pressing the green connection button. I answered the restricted jailhouse line with an incredibly calm, entirely measured, absolutely unyielding tone, perfectly projecting my immense corporate dominance entirely across the digital connection. I sat profoundly relaxed inside my incredibly secure, totally luxurious personal environment, perfectly ready to ruthlessly hear the pathetic, entirely desperate begging of the exact highly toxic man who had so arrogantly attempted to illegally steal my entire legacy right here tonight entirely perfectly. Devin instantly broke down completely violently, sobbing directly into the heavy plastic jailhouse receiver, the absolute exact second he heard my completely steady, entirely uncompromising voice echoing over the restricted line. His incredibly toxic arrogance had completely evaporated, entirely replaced by an absolutely pathetic, deeply humiliating wave of pure, unadulterated terror. He desperately stammered through incredibly heavy, highly frantic gasps for precious air, fiercely apologizing for aggressively dismissing my profound paternal warnings regarding Natalie's insanely destructive financial greed. He wildly cried loudly, begging for my immediate absolute forgiveness regarding his entirely disgraceful behavior during our highly tense Christmas Eve dinner interaction. He intensely apologized for intentionally forcing me to practically pack my personal belongings inside a deeply insulting, incredibly cheap canvas suitcase when he so ruthlessly kicked me completely out of his pristine suburban home. The incredibly ruined, severely panicked executive sounded absolutely nothing like the extremely powerful, deeply arrogant man who had so eagerly attempted to legally steal my entire hidden fortune. He practically screamed into the restricted receiver, fiercely pleading for me to immediately transfer the incredibly massive, completely unaffordable federal bail amount required to physically release him from his highly terrifying concrete cage. He loudly promised to permanently abandon his highly manipulative wife, desperately vowing to entirely submit to my absolute total corporate authority if I simply wired the necessary legal funds tonight. His intensely frantic, incredibly desperate begging echoed loudly through the completely silent penthouse, explicitly highlighting his profound, absolute financial incompetence and utter personal destruction. He loudly wailed, shedding incredibly pathetic, entirely unearned tears while desperately attempting to emotionally manipulate my completely frozen heart to successfully escape the catastrophic legal nightmare he had intentionally created, completely independently, without any external assistance whatsoever. Right here tonight. Absolutely. Right now. Entirely alone, permanently without fail exactly this evening. I listened completely patiently to his incredibly pathetic, highly frantic verbal breakdown, allowing his intensely desperate sobbing to severely echo across the silent digital connection for several very long, entirely suffocating minutes. I felt absolutely zero paternal obligation to suddenly rescue the exact, incredibly toxic, deeply arrogant man who had so ruthlessly attempted to permanently erase my entire financial legacy. I took a slow, highly deliberate sip of my incredibly smooth, remarkably expensive bourbon, entirely maintaining my absolute, uncompromising emotional detachment from his profoundly degrading legal catastrophe. I leaned slightly forward, speaking directly into the sleek digital phone with an incredibly sharp, remarkably cold, entirely unyielding tone that instantly silenced his violently frantic wailing. I calmly informed my completely ruined son that absolute true respect, genuine familial loyalty, and profound personal integrity could absolutely never be blindly purchased with massive federal bail money. I firmly stated that his incredibly destructive, entirely greedy decisions had permanently guaranteed his impending highly isolated federal incarceration, absolutely explicitly declaring that he must entirely independently face the extremely brutal consequences of his massive corporate crimes completely alone today. I did not offer a single tiny ounce of undeserved paternal comfort, nor did I ever bother issuing any basic polite farewell before aggressively ending the highly restricted jailhouse communication permanently. I firmly pressed the red disconnection button, instantly severing the digital link and completely dropping his entirely shattered existence straight back into the freezing, totally inescapable concrete void. Without showing a single fraction of a second of human hesitation, I explicitly instructed my private telecom provider to immediately permanently block the regional county detention center's designated outgoing phone number. I calmly turned completely around silently, watching the glowing city skyline, perfectly knowing my incredibly satisfying, totally absolute retaliation was entirely flawlessly complete right here tonight, forever. Exactly 7 days after the highly public, incredibly humiliating federal arrests completely shattered my deeply arrogant son and his immensely toxic wife, I returned silently to the sprawling suburban estate. The massive residential property felt entirely different now, completely stripped of their incredibly fake, heavily manufactured elite status. The towering mahogany front doors opened into a remarkably hollow, deeply echoing grand foyer, entirely devoid of Natalie's highly expensive, utterly superficial designer decorations. I stood firmly upon the scratched, imported marble flooring, feeling absolutely zero paternal regret or residual emotional attachment regarding their totally catastrophic, entirely self-inflicted criminal destruction. I specifically hired a highly specialized, fiercely efficient commercial cleaning crew to aggressively sanitize the entire massive property from top to bottom today. I explicitly instructed the completely unsmiling foreman to ruthlessly eliminate every single lingering trace of Devin and Natalie's incredibly parasitic existence from my private estate. The dedicated industrial team immediately swarmed the massive luxury house, violently scrubbing the immaculate granite countertops and aggressively deep cleaning the expensive plush carpets using highly potent chemical solvents. I watched completely silently as they methodically dismantled the remaining pathetic fragments of Natalie's incredibly arrogant suburban fantasy, aggressively throwing abandoned designer garment bags and completely useless luxury cosmetic bottles directly into thick black industrial trash bags. The heavy mechanical hum of the high-powered commercial vacuums aggressively drowned out the lingering, deeply toxic echoes of my son's entirely pathetic, incredibly cowardly jailhouse sobbing. I walked slowly through the massive living room, perfectly ensuring the incredibly diligent cleaning crew entirely erased their profoundly disgraceful marital failure permanently. My completely frozen heart felt remarkably steady as I actively reclaimed my absolute, entirely unquestionable legal authority over the exact physical space they had so ruthlessly attempted to illegally steal from me forever today, right now. I aggressively walked through the completely silent, entirely empty rooms, meticulously inspecting the profound structural devastation Natalie had recklessly inflicted upon my incredibly valuable property. Her deeply arrogant, entirely unpermitted basement renovations had violently compromised the fundamental architectural stability, actively jeopardizing the heavy load-bearing beams supporting the massive luxury estate. I specifically contracted an incredibly elite, highly professional architectural restoration firm to aggressively rebuild the severely damaged foundational pillars exactly according to strict municipal safety codes today. The highly skilled structural engineers worked incredibly swiftly, violently demolishing her deeply stupid, entirely illegal cosmetic alterations before actively reinforcing the massive concrete foundation directly beneath the sprawling main floor. I aggressively demanded absolute sheer perfection, ruthlessly ordering the professional contractors to completely restore the incredible original integrity of the gleaming hardwood floors immediately. The dedicated carpenters aggressively sanded away the deep, highly visible gouge marks left permanently behind by Natalie's frantically dragged designer luggage during her completely pathetic, entirely cowardly attempted escape. They meticulously applied incredibly rich, perfectly smooth mahogany stains, flawlessly returning the massive residential space entirely back to its profoundly beautiful, originally immaculate architectural condition. I firmly stood inside the completely restored, highly secure basement, perfectly watching the incredibly strong steel beams permanently replace her absolutely toxic, highly illegal aesthetic modifications right now. My incredibly wealthy, entirely private corporate trust aggressively financed the massive structural restoration without registering a single tiny ounce of basic financial hesitation today. The massive suburban estate felt incredibly clean, deeply grounded, and completely structurally secure, once again, utterly cleansed of her violently destructive, incredibly ignorant architectural negligence. I proudly surveyed the flawlessly repaired, entirely stabilized foundational pillars, perfectly satisfied that my immense personal wealth had successfully permanently reversed the massive physical damage caused directly by their incredibly toxic, profoundly pathetic marital greed absolutely forever. Gregory arrived perfectly punctually at the sprawling suburban estate precisely at noon, smoothly stepping onto the completely restored, absolutely pristine mahogany front porch. My fiercely loyal, highly meticulous corporate attorney carried a thick, incredibly secure black leather briefcase containing the absolute final legally binding property deeds. He calmly walked directly into the massive, entirely empty living room, proudly presenting the official municipal documents permanently confirming my completely undisputed, absolute personal ownership over the incredibly expensive physical asset. I aggressively grabbed my expensive gold fountain pen and smoothly signed the highly critical legal paperwork, forcefully pressing the dark black ink directly into the crisp white parchment. I explicitly ordered Gregory to absolutely immediately remove the massive luxury house completely off the highly competitive regional real estate market today. I completely rejected any immensely greedy desire to actively liquidate the deeply compromised physical property for massive personal financial profit right now. Instead, I firmly instructed my highly efficient legal team to entirely permanently transfer the absolute total ownership of the sprawling suburban estate directly over to a specific, highly respected charitable organization, completely immediately. Gregory silently nodded explicitly, understanding my incredibly powerful, totally uncompromising corporate directive without registering a single ounce of professional confusion. I strictly demanded that the massive multi-million-dollar legal transfer be entirely finalized perfectly before sunset, ruthlessly converting the exact physical monument of my son's absolutely toxic, immensely pathetic marital greed into a profoundly positive, incredibly vital public asset. The completely ironclad legal documents permanently severed Devon's entirely fraudulent, deeply arrogant suburban legacy entirely right here today, absolutely forever. I stared proudly out the massive panoramic windows, perfectly satisfied, knowing this incredibly beautiful, fully restored physical environment would officially serve a genuinely honorable, highly magnificent community purpose, permanently without fail. Exactly today, right now, absolutely, completely, forever. The highly respected philanthropic foundation strictly specialized in aggressively providing incredibly secure, entirely fully funded residential housing, completely dedicated toward violently uplifting, deeply marginalized, highly vulnerable African American youth. I firmly believed that aggressively transforming the absolute exact physical location of my profoundly pathetic son's incredibly toxic, immensely greedy criminal enterprise directly into a highly vital, completely safe community sanctuary would officially represent the absolute ultimate total moral victory today. My incredibly immense, totally undisputed personal wealth effectively guaranteed that absolutely dozens of highly disadvantaged, completely deserving teenagers would immediately receive an incredibly beautiful, entirely pristine architectural environment perfectly designed to permanently foster their absolute profound academic and personal success. I actively converted my intensely raw, deeply unforgiving, paternal disappointment straight into an incredibly powerful, entirely magnificent public resource completely capable of permanently actively changing perfectly innocent lives entirely forever right now. The incredibly sprawling, completely fully renovated luxury estate definitively ceased physically functioning as a highly pathetic, totally superficial suburban monument to Devon's massively illegal corporate embezzlement. It became an incredibly sturdy, absolutely impenetrable concrete fortress, perfectly ensuring genuine, heavily funded communal hope completely permanently right here today. While I stood completely silently observing the perfectly empty, brilliantly illuminated mahogany foyer, a strict federal courier aggressively approached the completely pristine front door. The entirely unsmiling government agent smoothly handed me a thick, remarkably heavy white legal envelope permanently containing a highly official, completely mandatory federal legal subpoena. I slowly broke the thick adhesive seal, perfectly discovering that the deeply aggressive federal prosecutors explicitly absolutely demanded my extremely critical, entirely public testimony directly at Devon and Natalie's impending, highly catastrophic, massive criminal sentencing hearing very soon. I smiled an incredibly dark, fiercely unyielding smile, absolutely entirely ready to definitively permanently seal their incredibly pathetic, deeply arrogant federal destruction entirely today. The incredibly tense federal courtroom remained absolutely suffocating and entirely silent, completely stripped of the usual chaotic metropolitan background noise. Devon and Natalie sat strictly rigidly at the heavy wooden defense table, physically wearing identically bright, terribly humiliating orange prison jumpsuits. The incredibly stark penal uniforms completely obliterated their formerly pristine, highly curated suburban aesthetic permanently today. They remained entirely physically separated by their highly expensive, deeply frustrated criminal defense attorneys absolutely refusing to cast a single sideways glance toward one another. The incredibly toxic, highly parasitic marriage had utterly disintegrated into sheer radioactive hatred the exact moment the heavy steel county jail doors violently slammed shut behind them months ago. Natalie stared completely blankly toward the incredibly imposing mahogany judicial bench, her heavily powdered, deeply arrogant face entirely replaced by a terribly sunken, violently pale mask of sheer unadulterated terror. She practically vibrated with immense, uncontrollable panic, her shaking, manicured hands aggressively chained securely together by heavy industrial steel handcuffs resting loudly against the polished table. Devon slumped pathetically forward, his violently sweating forehead practically touching the scattered legal documents explicitly detailing his massive corporate destruction. He silently, continuously rubbed his incredibly cold, heavily shackled wrists entirely crushed by the absolute apocalyptic reality currently annihilating his previously prestigious executive existence completely right now. The incredibly heavy oak gallery doors swung smoothly open, immediately drawing every single terrified eye entirely across the expansive courtroom directly toward the main entrance. The highly aggressive Metropolitan Press Corps practically held their collective breaths, aggressively poising their digital recorders to perfectly capture the absolute final devastating chapter of this completely ruinous family tragedy today. The deeply intimidating federal bailiff stepped aggressively forward, loudly instructing the absolutely packed courtroom to stand immediately as the presiding federal judge swiftly entered the incredibly tense room right now perfectly. I stepped confidently toward the polished mahogany witness stand, moving with absolute, entirely uncompromising corporate authority. I deliberately ignored their violently shaking, incredibly pathetic figures, completely firmly raising my right hand to officially swear absolute total honesty before the strictly silent federal courtroom today. I calmly adjusted the small silver microphone, perfectly projecting my incredibly deep, entirely steady voice straight across the completely packed gallery, without raising my tone or displaying a single ounce of highly toxic paternal anger. I methodically recounted the incredibly massive, completely undeniable systematic financial abuse Devon and Natalie had so aggressively executed against my entirely private estate. I coldly presented the absolutely irrefutable digital evidence meticulously collected by Dominic, heavily detailing the incredibly arrogant, intensely destructive real estate forgery they had violently forced into existence. I explicitly described Natalie's perfectly recorded, immensely vicious demand for absolute pristine fraud, flawlessly highlighting her deeply arrogant, entirely horrific manipulation of the fake governmental notary stamp. I ruthlessly laid out the exact, incredibly toxic, deeply catastrophic timeline of Devon's massive corporate embezzlement scheme, officially demonstrating exactly how my incredibly foolish son had aggressively stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars to desperately fund her entirely fake, wildly expensive suburban lifestyle. I never yelled fiercely, maintaining an incredibly composed, perfectly frozen, emotional detachment that entirely terrified the completely paralyzed defense table. I explicitly stripped away every single pathetic, deeply manipulative excuse they had previously fabricated, violently exposing their absolute sheer, unadulterated greed directly to the fiercely attentive federal judge right here today. My completely emotionless, highly calculated public testimony systematically annihilated their incredibly desperate legal defense, permanently, entirely locking their immensely destructive criminal fate perfectly into place, without showing absolutely any basic human hesitation or entirely misplaced paternal mercy right now, within this extremely cold, silent room, completely forever today. The severely imposing federal judge stared fiercely down from the towering mahogany bench, aggressively projecting an aura of completely absolute, undeniably terrifying judicial authority today. He coldly reviewed the incredibly massive, completely devastating stack of irrefutable corporate evidence permanently condemning my entirely ruined son and his incredibly toxic wife. The incredibly profound silence within the heavily packed courtroom practically completely suffocated the violently trembling, deeply pathetic defendants as the judge slowly leaned forward to properly deliver the utterly brutal, completely final verdict. He loudly declared that Devon's absolutely incredible, entirely unhinged corporate embezzlement and highly destructive wire fraud required extremely severe, permanently life-altering federal consequences entirely immediately. The judge ruthlessly slammed his heavy wooden gavel downward, officially sentencing Devon to a completely inescapable 5 exact years inside a highly restricted, perfectly violent federal penitentiary right now. Devon completely collapsed forward against the heavy defense table, loudly sobbing, absolutely pathetic. Deeply humiliating tears of pure, unadulterated terror as his entire executive future permanently, completely evaporated today. The intensely strict federal judge then aggressively turned his remarkably cold, utterly unforgiving gaze directly toward Natalie's incredibly pale, violently shaking face. He fiercely condemned her absolutely terrifying, highly manipulative real estate forgery and incredibly toxic, purely incredibly destructive criminal conspiracy. He loudly, officially, explicitly sentenced her to a completely mandatory, extremely brutal 7 consecutive years of incredibly harsh federal incarceration entirely immediately today. Natalie violently gasped, her completely arrogant, deeply superficial suburban illusion violently shattering into a million tiny, entirely irrecoverable pieces directly onto the polished floor. The absolutely devastating, completely catastrophic criminal sentence definitively, totally obliterated their incredibly pathetic, immensely greedy lives, absolutely permanently. The strictly terrifying reality of spending practically an entire brutal decade locked securely behind incredibly thick concrete walls completely, permanently, entirely, utterly broke them both perfectly, exactly today. 2 heavily armed, incredibly strict federal bailiffs immediately stepped aggressively forward, firmly grabbing Devon and Natalie by their brightly colored, entirely humiliating orange prison shoulders today. The highly intimidating officers roughly forced the violently sobbing, completely ruined couple physically upward, ruthlessly preparing to officially violently march them directly toward the deeply terrifying concrete holding cells entirely right now. As the heavy steel chains rattled loudly against the perfectly polished courtroom floor, Devon desperately twisted his completely pale, intensely sweating face entirely backward over his trembling shoulder. He stared directly at my perfectly tailored, incredibly rigid figure, his intensely pathetic, deeply bloodshot eyes violently pleading for a single tiny ounce of completely unearned paternal sympathy or absolutely basic human comfort today. I stood entirely perfectly motionless behind the solid mahogany railing, staring completely coldly back at his absolutely destroyed, incredibly pitiful existence without registering a single fraction of emotional hesitation. I absolutely completely refused to offer him an incredibly simple nod or a desperately pathetic reassuring wave of my completely steady hand right now. I simply turned my broad back directly against his incredibly loud, wildly hysterical weeping, perfectly projecting my absolute total, entirely uncompromising detachment permanently today. I confidently walked straight out of the incredibly heavy oak courtroom doors, completely ignoring the incredibly bright, violently flashing cameras of the aggressive metropolitan press, perfectly gathered directly outside the immediate judicial exit entirely right now. I marched aggressively down the completely pristine marble corridor, breathing absolutely perfectly clear, entirely untroubled air for the exact first time in incredibly highly agonizing months. I confidently headed absolutely entirely straight toward my highly secure, completely strictly temperature-controlled downtown storage facility to permanently, efficiently, actively finalize my absolute single most completely important, deeply, intensely profound personal task. Perfectly. Right here, entirely today, absolutely exactly now. I smoothly swiped my highly encrypted digital access card against the completely flawless security scanner actively guarding the incredibly pristine, entirely heavily fortified downtown storage facility today. The incredibly massive, perfectly solid titanium doors slid aggressively open with a remarkably quiet, highly sophisticated mechanical hum, instantly revealing the completely dark, absolutely strictly climate-controlled interior environment right now. The incredibly cool, perfectly filtered air washed completely over my deeply composed, entirely perfectly tailored figure as I stepped proudly directly inside the immensely secure concrete vault alone. I walked deliberately past dozens of perfectly stacked, entirely uniformly sealed industrial crates completely untouched by the incredibly toxic, highly chaotic suburban destruction I had just permanently, utterly annihilated absolutely today. Sitting perfectly safely in the absolute exact center of the completely flawless concrete room rested Naomi's incredibly breathtaking, deeply, highly cherished, hand-carved, solid mahogany dining table perfectly. The incredibly beautiful, entirely profoundly irreplaceable family heirloom possessed a magnificent, deeply rich wooden sheen that flawlessly, entirely survived Natalie's incredibly vicious, completely arrogant suburban purging right here today. Dominic had absolutely, incredibly successfully, entirely rescued this perfectly profound, completely gorgeous physical manifestation of genuine matrimonial love directly from the highly disgusting, completely filthy local junk facility exactly months ago, absolutely right now. I ran my completely steady bare fingers slowly across the absolutely perfectly smooth, deeply intricately carved wooden edges completely today, perfectly right now, entirely. The entirely incredibly immense, absolutely perfectly, completely profound emotional connection entirely heavily radiated straight completely from the totally, absolutely, perfectly stunning antique furniture permanently right now today, completely. I stared absolutely incredibly deeply, directly at the completely perfect, entirely completely, historically massive mahogany surface, completely entirely knowing absolutely perfectly that true genuine legacy, absolutely incredibly completely beautifully, permanently, perfectly, incredibly flawlessly, entirely undeniably survived right here today. A highly specialized, completely entirely professional team of elite metropolitan luxury movers arrived incredibly punctually at the profoundly secure downtown storage unit, absolutely, completely, perfectly today. The entirely heavily muscled, incredibly flawlessly uniformed workers aggressively, gently, entirely lifted Naomi's completely precious, intensely beautiful hand, carved solid mahogany dining table incredibly perfectly right now. They meticulously wrapped the incredibly stunning, utterly profound antique heirloom inside, immensely thick, perfectly, completely, flawlessly padded industrial moving blankets, absolutely perfectly, permanently today, right now, completely, entirely. I silently, proudly, actively supervised the incredibly highly sensitive, completely, entirely delicate physical extraction, explicitly, fiercely demanding, absolutely total, sheer, perfect, zero damage, completely, permanently, right here today, absolutely right now. The totally, completely pristine luxury transport van carefully navigated the incredibly busy, totally, completely, entirely bustling metropolitan district efficiently, smoothly, arriving directly at my perfectly, totally, absolutely, completely, ultra-luxurious downtown penthouse, incredibly, completely right now, today, perfectly. The highly skilled professional moving crew carefully navigated the entirely, perfectly private, completely, incredibly high-speed glass elevator straight upward, entirely, completely. Right here, directly today. They completely, effortlessly, completely, flawlessly carried the totally, incredibly massive, absolutely, perfectly, completely, absolutely beautiful mahogany table directly inside my completely expansive, entirely, perfectly, completely, heavily, entirely, ultra-modern living space, absolutely, completely right now. They entirely, perfectly, completely positioned the utterly, absolutely, incredibly, deeply precious wooden heirloom, entirely, completely, incredibly, perfectly, entirely straight, directly, entirely straight, against the totally, completely, beautifully massive floor-to-ceiling, completely, entirely, exactly glass windows, completely right now today, completely. The incredibly spectacular, absolutely, entirely, completely, deeply, perfectly, breathtaking, panoramic view of the entirely, completely, beautifully, profoundly, heavily, absolutely, entirely stunning city skyline, perfectly, absolutely, incredibly, completely, deeply, perfectly illuminated, the totally, entirely, incredibly gorgeous antique table, completely, perfectly, absolutely, entirely right now, today. I stepped smoothly toward the pristine crystal decanter resting beautifully upon my fully stocked, ultra-modern luxury wet bar inside the massive downtown penthouse today. I deliberately poured an incredibly generous, deeply rich measure of profoundly expensive, heavily aged amber bourbon directly into a perfectly polished, extremely heavy crystal drinking glass right now. The incredibly solid, perfectly chilled crystal felt profoundly reassuring, resting comfortably inside my completely steady, totally unwavering right hand as I calmly walked directly toward the stunning dining area. I moved incredibly slowly, respectfully approaching the absolute exact head of Naomi's flawlessly restored, deeply breathtaking, completely massive hand, carved mahogany table perfectly positioned right here today. I sat down completely confidently upon the incredibly plush, deeply comfortable leather executive dining chair, fully claiming my entirely rightful, absolute permanent position at the head of my family legacy. I stared deeply across the completely flawless, incredibly gorgeous wooden surface, explicitly admiring the incredibly rich, perfectly polished mahogany grains glowing brilliantly under the soft, modern penthouse lighting right now. I silently reflected upon the incredibly painful, absolutely, completely devastating, yet profoundly, utterly necessary action of aggressively cutting deeply toxic, purely parasitic bloodlines permanently, entirely out of my life today. I clearly understood that completely destroying Devon's incredibly pathetic, profoundly greedy suburban existence was absolutely fundamentally required to permanently actively preserve my own genuine legacy and absolute total self-respect forever. The incredibly harsh, entirely brutal, emotional federal consequences successfully delivered absolute complete justice against their incredibly arrogant, completely unforgiving criminal deception right now. My incredibly frozen, entirely unyielding heart felt absolutely, completely, perfectly settled, deeply secure in the undeniable, irrefutable knowledge that my extremely beautiful, perfectly brilliant late wife's profound historical legacy was entirely, perfectly, securely, eternally safe from incredibly toxic, purely, completely destructive, absolute greedy corruption permanently right here now. The incredibly brilliant, entirely majestic evening sun slowly descended perfectly directly behind the massive, entirely sprawling metropolitan skyline, beautifully casting incredibly long, deeply gorgeous golden shadows completely across my pristine penthouse today. The incredibly spectacular, intensely breathtaking urban sunset vividly illuminated the absolute, total, entirely unshakable, perfect peace, officially permeating my incredibly secure, entirely, completely, ultra-luxurious downtown residential sanctuary right here, right now. There were absolutely entirely zero incredibly pathetic, wildly frantic telephone calls, desperately demanding entirely unearned, completely massive financial bailouts violently ringing across my completely silent, perfectly pristine personal digital smartphone tonight. There were entirely, absolutely no incredibly toxic, profoundly ignorant suburban demands for massively, incredibly expensive designer luxury purchases, aggressively polluting my entirely beautiful, perfectly quiet evening completely today, perfectly right now. There was absolutely only incredibly pure, profoundly absolute, entirely, completely flawless, total, unadulterated, beautiful peace permanently, comfortably, completely resting, exactly right here inside this entirely massive, perfectly, incredibly beautiful living space tonight. The incredibly difficult, totally, profoundly, absolutely painful silent adjustment was now entirely, officially, entirely, permanently, perfectly, fully, completely, flawlessly, strictly, cleanly, successfully, exactly, safely, accurately, perfectly, undeniably, fully, exclusively, finally, officially, completely, entirely complete. I had absolutely, perfectly, entirely, successfully, aggressively, forcefully, strictly reclaimed my entirely, deeply, incredibly gorgeous, beautiful private life permanently, perfectly, completely, efficiently, immediately, exactly, utterly, thoroughly, cleanly, exclusively, accurately, forever, completely. I had completely, flawlessly, brilliantly, fully, effectively, officially, correctly, beautifully, successfully, exclusively, officially, securely, successfully, perfectly, legally, entirely, exactly, specifically, totally, purely, thoroughly, totally reclaimed my incredibly massive, completely, incredibly immense personal, corporate, financial wealth exactly today, accurately, precisely, perfectly, fully, absolutely, correctly, reliably, securely. I had entirely, successfully, completely, perfectly, explicitly, purely, strongly, completely, correctly, formally, strictly, authentically, genuinely, correctly, utterly, cleanly, effectively, precisely reclaimed my absolute, true, pure human dignity right now today. The profound lesson learned is that unearned privilege inevitably breeds unparalleled arrogance, which eventually destroys the foundation of trust required to sustain a family. Money does not automatically generate respect, nor does it guarantee genuine loyalty. True strength lies in recognizing when a toxic relationship, even with your own flesh and blood, is actively poisoning your legacy. Severing those ties is not an act of cruelty, but an essential step toward absolute self-preservation and lasting peace. Have you ever faced a deeply painful family betrayal that required a harsh but necessary adjustment? Share your personal experience securely below today.